Hey, everybody, welcome to the pre-stream. We are just hanging out here with a little night school intro music as we prepare today to go to history class, which we will be doing here shortly. But first, before we get into it, I was ready. I have eaten. I have my white sugar-free monster ready to go. So why not go live, right? I'm hanging out. Oh. You see, if I if I didn't have, when when I'm streaming, I'm locked in. But if I ever did if I was ever one of those streamers that it'd be weird for me to be one of those streamers that just doesn't really pay attention to the stream and just kind of exists and occasionally is quiet and just, is focusing on something else. You just hear the tick, 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 tick of keyboards and stuff like that. It'd be very strange for me. Crack a window here. It actually just occurred to me that I am not on a Zoom call, so I actually don't need my headphones. Oh. Anyways, we'll get into the Ranger stuff here shortly, but in the meantime, we're, just hang out, talk about whatever, and see what people want to, whatever people want to talk about. We've got, just adjusting some sound. There we go. What's up? Every pixel counts. Hello, hello. Hey, thank you, Irish Writer, for joining the adventure. Appreciate that. New member. Fantastic. Welcome. Welcome, welcome. What's going on, Lance? George? Kendall has been waiting for this one for months. Well, hopefully we will not disappoint. Mark is commenting me on my bad title. Come on, Ranger Danger. That's good, right? They've all been puns. All of the, A good class is Bard to find. Gone rogue. Monks are stunning. Smitten with the paladin. Come on. Well, that's not exactly true, Beowulf. I think the overwhelming majority say they want to roll fairly minimally, perhaps in a more simplistic and easier fashion than in an exact manner or duplication that the players do. That seems to be the least popular of the choices. I'm not, and I don't, again, there's probably some confusion in the poll. I certainly think there's a place for people or for the dungeon master, the game master, to roll things like random encounters or reaction charts and things of that nature. I just don't want to be bound to the same type of die rolls that the players are bound to. I don't want to be making checks and attack rolls and saving throws. That's not interesting to anybody, I don't think. All right, I'm glad somebody appreciates them. Thank you, Arta. Whew. Well, somewhat stymied again. We are in the process of still continuing to do our sort of ongoing session zeros of Fabula Ultima for our home game, and we were all set this Friday everyone has a pretty firm character idea, and there's still some wiggle room, which is good because I want to get together with the group and I want to perform, do some backstory cards, to do some not only backstory generations, but to take a page out of the Avatar Last Airbender game, Avatar Legends game, and kind of do the character's first adventure as a collab creation event rather than actually play it. So essentially, the first session that they actually play as players, their characters will have already gone on an adventure, and we will have just described it the time before. Anyways, turns out this Friday's Valentine's Day, which means nothing to me and nothing to George and nothing to Tim, but it means a lot to Kaz and Smith and Bob, who of course are married. So unfortunately, I'm not sure what we're going to do to get that done. And we may just end up doing it online. Would you call a ranger who doesn't use a ranged weapon a meleeer? Perhaps. Actually, as we'll see, the ranger originally, while capable of using a bow, certainly was definitely a class that was sort of more melee oriented. They are. To go ranging, right, means to wander in the wilderness, basically. So a ranger is someone who ranges, which is to say wanders the wilderness, basically. They're not named. They're definitely not named after being a ranged attacker. Well, we'll talk about Dritz. We'll talk about Aragorn. We'll talk about Tanis Half-Elven. We'll talk about the whole 9 yards. We'll talk about. We have a lot to cover. The editions are ready. We've got first edition. We've got second edition. We've got 3.0. We've got 3.5. We've got 4th edition. And we even have 5th edition. And of course, we have Pathfinder 1. But Pathfinder 1 is basically 3.5, basically. Technically, I don't have 5.0. I actually put that book in storage. So actually, technically, all I have is 5.5. Technically, this is the 2024 version. Come on now, this is the pre-show. We're not going to be talking about Rangers just yet. But that's kind of a trick question because I don't like Rangers. I don't know. That's tough. Sam, we'll talk about it when we get through it. I mean, there's definitely. I mean, I've played with a lot. Have I ever played a Ranger? No. I think in 32 years of playing Dungeons and Dragons, I have never played a Ranger. So I've had a lot of people who've played Rangers. In fact, the very first player character that Smith made when we played AD&D 2nd edition, we met 7th grade, junior high. We met at the bus stop. I heard him and my other great friend Justin. They were in the same homeroom, and they were talking about Dungeons and Dragons, which I knew about, of course. I was playing with my uncle and my cousin at that time, 1st edition, and they were talking about Dungeons and Dragons. So I said, "Oh, blah blah," and they said, "Yeah, we just started. We're just started playing. My dad, lent me his books or whatever." And the very first character that. Actually, the very first character that both of them made were Rangers. And ironically enough, Justin made a Ranger named Arathorn, which is named after Aragorn's dad. But not that, I don't know that most people probably don't know that. I mean, maybe they do because Legolas has that line, right? This is Aragorn, son of Arathorn. But I don't know how many people would recognize Arathorn as being Aragorn's father. But at that time and place, like, people didn't know Tolkien the way that they know him now. So not many of our other friends even knew who Arathorn was. They maybe thought, oh, it's like Aragorn, but not. So anyways, Arathorn was one. And then Smith's Ranger was named Sebastian. Sebastian the Ranger. But they were both Rangers. And Lance's first character was a Pathfinder 1 ranger. That's awesome. Beowulf says Ranger should be the best class. Thematically, what's not to love, but sadly they almost fall short. That's fair. That was the Wind Ball caster. You're right. That was DQ1. You're absolutely right. Well, Samuel, actually, maybe I can put this. Let me see if I can put this in the description or something. I don't know how YouTube works, even though I should. Okay, here we go. Share. So I'll put this in the chat, but I'll put this into the description below too. So if you are interested, this is actually the 11th. This is actually the 11th stream that we've done, and it's taken us, let's see, about two years, I think, give or take. Let me put this into the description below. Let's see here. Our first stream that we did was, so this is live stream number 275. And our very first history class was live stream number 90, which occurred May 4th. Okay, May 4th, 2023. So almost 2 years ago. So we've been at this for about 2 years, almost 22 months, give or take. And yeah, so what is my, anyways, so I have discussed this somewhat at length in other streams. And the last one that we did was on, I think, the wizard. And historically, the wizard has been my favorite class. I've probably played more wizards than any other class in the game. Actually, if we do, this is the last class that we need to do. This is the 11th class that we do. And again, when I say 11 classes, a lot of people nowadays think of D&D or they think of Pathfinder, they think of 12 classes. And that's because of the existence of the Warlock in D&D 5e and the existence of the Alchemist in Pathfinder 2nd edition. But of course, the Alchemist and the Warlock don't really have a heritage the way that these other classes do. These other classes essentially go all the way back to essentially the beginning of the class or the beginning of the game. The Warlock was never really a thing. It got made as like a weird class that was thrown in at the end of 3rd edition of D&D when they were kind of playtesting early 4th edition, and eventually was a 4th edition class. And then 5th edition, obviously, Warlock becomes sort of the standard, one of the standard defining classes. And then Alchemist was never really a class until Pathfinder 1 and Pathfinder 2. So in my mind, there's sort of these 11 core classes that have sort of existed in some form or fashion since the 1970s. And of those classes, Barbarian is a class I have played several times in 3rd edition. Not my favorite class, but I think it's fun. You know, I don't know that I would want to play it for a very long time, but it is fun. Cleric. I like the cleric class. I don't know that I've ever been a cleric class because anytime I want to be a cleric, I usually just end up being a paladin, which is a class that I like rather much. Bard is a class I actually like a fair amount. I've played a number of bards in Pathfinder 1 and 4th edition. So I've played a mix of bards, which I think is cool. I think I even played one in 3rd edition. So no clerics. Same thing with druids. I don't think I've ever played a druid or a cleric, to my knowledge. Fighter, of course, I've played plenty of fighters. They're pretty good. Monks. Even though my background was martial arts, I grew up doing taekwondo and was a black belt, and I used to compete and all that other stuff. I've never really found the monk very particularly interesting myself. I would, if I was going to be a monk, I would just be a spellcaster. Kind of the way I thought of it. Rogue, Ranger, not my favorite classes. Sorcerer, Paladin, yes. And Wizard, big yes. So I would say my favorite classes are Wizard, Paladin, Fighter, Bard. Weldil, if you go back all the way to our a good class is bard to find video, you will know that the bard was sort of the original prestige class. You actually had to be 3 other classes first before you could start becoming a bard. So bards were kind of like this super powered prestige class in some ways. But I mean, I think everybody has played a ranger at some point. I think that's just like a sort of a given at this point in the game. But anyways, we'll go ahead and get started here shortly. And hopefully I remember too to put a timestamp in the description so people can jump ahead. How is everybody doing? Do we have a lot of people? Probably not. Oh, 72. That's pretty good. We've actually been getting some views later. Oh, this is a good time to remind everybody. If you're going to enjoy this content, please like and leave a comment, even if the comment is just, hey, KLC is great, or Derek is an idiot. Every bit of interaction helps us with the algorithm and maybe exposes us to 1 or 2 new people who would never, ever, 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 ever have found us. So if you could do that, please like and comment. And you're probably already subscribed, but if you're not, subscribe. What's up, Marcos? Good to see you. And of course, if you want to throw your support this way to the channel, we don't really get views, so we pretty much rely on your tips and your direct support. If you want to join our Patreon, there's a link in the description for that. And of course, we also always accept super chats and stream elements tips. Our goals today are more of a celebration of completing this series, and also maybe more of a poll or a thought or an open conversation with the chat about what should we do next. Plem, we will get into that, including some of the sort of controversy around that, and where it may or may not have come on, where it may or may not have entered into the lexicon of the game. So, but we'll go ahead and get started here in a couple minutes. Interesting, Pathfinder. I did not know. Try to make the comment at least 8 words long. It's supposed to be better for the algorithm. Who the hell knows? Get my tablet out here. My tablet, my Wacom. We will be going to the whiteboard, I'm sure. In fact, I know we will be. It's school time. It's history class. Let's go. Like any good history class, we're going to discuss multiple things and how they connect together and interact with them and create a education for your betterment. You're supposed to be laying down and sick and recovering, sir. The people want you back on. You have to get better. This is definitely one of the, we'll talk about this divide between what the martial versus the non-martial ranger, and sort of what is right and what is wrong, and historically where it sort of came from. But we'll see where we get to it. All right. We'll probably go through them all first, and then we'll maybe revisit that at the end. And if I don't remember, bother me, and then hopefully we will do that. All righty. So for those of you who didn't care about the pre-stream, we'll be getting started now. So.
Let's get ready to RPG!
RPG! RPG! RPG! RPG! RPG!
Hello, everyone, and good evening. Welcome to the Knights of Last Call. My name is Derek Melinda. Thank you for joining me on the final episode of our history class series, where we have gone through all 11 of the classic Dungeons & Dragons classes, and we've looked at their history and their origin in the game and how they have progressed from edition to edition to edition. So today we are doing the Ranger, a contentious class at best, and we have a lot here to talk about. So thank you for joining. Please like and comment. Let me know, what is your favorite edition of the Ranger? Do you like Martial Rangers? Or do you like Caster Rangers? Leave a comment below. I'd like to read them and give me your hot takes. That's always fun to read them from everybody. So today we are going to talk about the Ranger, and there's a lot to cover. But as with any good history lesson, we have to start at the beginning. We have to start with something even more. Not just D&D, okay? Not just D&D. We have to start at the very beginning, because to understand the Ranger, we have to understand Aragorn, okay? And we have to understand the entire history of Middle-earth. That's an exaggeration, but not much of one. So let me put something that isn't horrendously. There we go. What's up, Sorrel? Thank you.
Cyril tipped $5. Would like to see more on Crown and Skull since second book was just released.
Yeah, I don't know Crown and Skull that well, but you know, I'm not against it completely. I'm always interested into it. All right, so. We can talk about that inquest, and we can talk about the paladin thing. The paladin thing, I think, is overwrought mostly because of the lay on hands ability, which, you know, they say that the hand of the king will be healing hands. I don't necessarily know that I buy the whole paladin thing, and we'll get into this a little bit. Okay, well, we kind of need to go to the Silmarillion. We're not going to fully go into the Silmarillion. We'll go a little bit into the Silmarillion. Okay, so the first thing that you have to understand is that in Tolkien's Legendarium, okay, so we're used to Middle-earth, and I'm just going to be very, very sketchy with this drawing, okay? So we're used to Middle-earth, right, kind of looking like this, okay? And we've got the Misty Mountains here. Everybody knows the Misty Mountains, right? And we've got the White Mountains here of Gondor. Everybody remembers those from that awesome scene from Return of the King where the beacons are lit and they're going down the White Mountains. And here's Minas Tirith, okay? And then, of course, here is Mordor, which is this very convenient wall of mountains, right? Mount Doom is here, right? Barad-dûr is here. The Black Gate is here, okay? And then over here, here's where we've got Mirkwood, and then we got the Lonely Mountain from The Hobbit. And then here, west of the Misty Mountains, we have, where the Shire is, roughly here. This is the Shire. Well, what you need to remember, or what you need to know, is that in the beginning of Middle-earth, there was actually a whole other, chunk of Middle-earth, okay? There was a whole other part of the continents. And this area was called Beleriand. And this is where the Great War of Wrath was fought against Morgoth, Melkor, come to be known as Morgoth. And Morgoth was the original big bad guy. If Sauron is like a demigod, Morgoth was a god, literally, a corrupted Valar. And at this time, this occurred what was known as the First Age of Middle-earth. And at this time, there were a group of men who lived in Beleriand, okay, that were called the Edain, which is a Sindarin word. Sindarin is Elvish, which basically means man. And they helped the elves. They helped the Valar. They fought against Morgoth, right? They fought against him and helped defeat him and, right, send him to kill him. However, as a result of the War of Wrath, the continent, or the section of Middle-earth of this Beleriand, sank into the ocean. And the Edain people were, basically wiped out. And not entirely, but a lot of them died in the war. But then also their homeland went missing, right? Because it gets sank. So the Valar, those are the angelic servants of Eru Ilúvatar, felt, kind of bad about this. So what they did is they rose up a special island off the coast of Middle-earth, okay, which was called Númenor. And the Adain people went to live there, and it was a special place, and they were blessed by the Valar for being these, incredibly brave, incredibly loyal, incredibly good-hearted men. In addition, their first king was Elros, who you may not know, but you may know his brother, Elrond. Okay, and Elros and Elrond are both half-elven. It's just that in Tolkien's universe, when you're half-elf, you basically have to choose. Do you want to be a human or do you want to be elf? This is why Arwen is able to, quote-unquote, choose between being elven or human. That's not a choice all elves get. That is strictly for the descendants of, in this case, Elros and Elrond. Well, Elros, Elrond's brother, chose to be human and went to lead went to be with the Númenorian people. So at this point, the elves and the people that be started referring to the Adain, right, as the Dunedain, which basically means men of the West, because they were to the West. And sometimes it would be referred to as the men of Westerness. Anyways, basically, they were, kind of super awesome, and they were super strong. They lived a lot longer. They were taller. They were nobler of spirit. They were wiser. They were fundamentally good people. Well, eventually, all good things come to an end, and our boy Sauron makes his way to Númenor, and he starts corrupting the people of Númenor, including their king. And he convinces them that they should get in their ships, their boats, and they should sail west, and they should invade the lands of Aman. They should go to Valinor. They should make war against the Valar because they were dicks and they were keeping immortality a secret for themselves, blah, blah, blah. Well, Eru Ilúvatar, the god of Tolkien's universe, did not take too kindly for this, and he struck down Númenor. Okay? He blew it up. However, as he did this, okay, there were those in Númenor who were still loyal to the Valar, who were still standing up for what the Númenorians believed in, okay? And this king was known as Elendil, okay? Elendil. And Elendil, before the sinking and the breaking of the world, okay, he left Númenor with a band of his loyal followers, people who were still fundamentally good and loyal to the Valar. And they left Númenor, and they knew that, they knew that corruption was coming. They, maybe they received signs and warnings that this was going to happen. And Elendil left Númenor, and he came to Middle-earth. And when he arrived at Middle-earth, the shores of Middle-earth, he had his famous oath, which Aragorn, played by Viggo Mortensen, kind of sings at the end of Return of the King, which is Et erelu endorena atulien sinomen maruvan al hilindinar ten ambar meta, which means out of the great sea to Middle Earth I am come, here I shall abide with my heirs until the breaking or the ending of the world. And basically he said, I am taking my household, I am taking my noble line of people, and I am pledging it eternally to Middle Earth, right? And so we're gonna make it right. Now, Elendil had two sons, Anarion and Isildur, and they created two kingdoms. There was a kingdom to the south, which we all know is called Gondor. And then there was a kingdom to the north, which was called Arnor. And those were the two kingdoms of Middle-earth, of men, of Dunedain, right? Of these noble men. And of course, there weren't a lot of them. And they eventually came to kind of rule over these so-called lesser men, or sometimes known as the middle men. But they were possessed, right? This line of kings had this great noble stature and nature. Well, Gondor prevailed, even though Elendil dies, right? We see him get crushed by Sauron. And then, of course, Isildur dies. And, even Anarion eventually dies. But Gondor manages to limp on. But Arnor, the Northern Kingdom, at this point, the line is kind of the lines of the kingdoms are kind of broken. And the leadership of Arnor is sort of in question. It divides into several different countries. Oh, hey, Dr. Metropolis, thank you.
DR Metropolis tip $25. It's finally here. I have opinions. Looking forward to you explaining that martial rangers are the correct choice, right?
Dr. Metropolis, we will get to that. I'm going to say, how about this? I will say this. Yes, historically speaking, no, from an interesting perspective. Okay, we'll get to that. Okay, so Arnor is this kingdom to the north. It eventually splits into 3 smaller kingdoms. I'm not going to get into their names, Ruidar and some other things. But there's also an evil kingdom to the north, okay? And this is called Angmar. And that name may sound familiar to you because the Witch King of Angmar, right? One of, if not the most powerful Nazgul, one of Sauron's most powerful lieutenants. And Angmar, the Witch King of Angmar, essentially leads never-ending and constant war against the realms of Arnor, including these successor kingdoms, and eventually is successful in essentially burning down all their great cities and sort of breaking the power of the kingdom of that was once the great kingdom of Arnor and the kingdom of men. And now this land, which is called Eriador, kind of the lands to the west of the Misty Mountains, becomes kind of a forsaken land. And if we know our 4th edition lore, right, it's a world of points of light. You've got Bree, you've got the Shire, you've got the Grey Havens, but most of this land is, dark and uncivilized, and it's wilderness, and there's orcs and other foul creatures and trolls roaming its environments. Well, the line of people who came from Numenor, who were loyal to the Valar, who came with Elendil to Middle-earth, who remembered the oath that they took, never forgot that oath. And so the remaining Dunedain, which were actually these like almost angelic humans given holy charge by the Valar, continued their mission. And they worked in secret and silence, and they weren't known for, fighting great battles. Instead, they lived in the wilderness, and they fought and kept these realms safe. But they maintained secrecy because they were a diminished people, but they had great power and they had great perseverance in the face of evil. Yeah, guerrilla warriors is a way to think of it. And these people became known as the Rangers of the North. So this is the first thing that I think is most important to understand about the origin of the Ranger, is that in Tolkien's Legendarium, the Rangers of the North were, number one, principally and primarily, they were good. They were against evil. And two, and this is really important, they were not defending the wilderness, okay? They were not pro-trees. They were not pro-animals. They were not pro-wildlands and wilderness. They were fundamentally a force for civilization. They were the remnants of a once great kingdom. They were protecting the people, the remaining towns and cities and places like the Shire, from the ravages of the wilderness, which predominantly and principally meant, orcs and goblins and trolls and all those other nasty things. So while this was a wild land and the Rangers were forced to sort of, become adept woodsmen, they were never about the woods, okay? They were about defending people, and their battlefield, if you will, was the forest. Their battlefield was these wild lands, and so they needed to be adept and they needed to be good at that, okay? So that's Tolkien's Rangers, okay? And, of course, the chieftain of the Dunedain, the leader of those people, traces an unbroken line back to Elendil and Isildur. And of course, in the Lord of the Rings story, this is Aragorn. And as a result of his lineage, his kingship, he has theoretically the wherewithal to claim leadership of the people, the reunited kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor, which is what the whole ending of the movie is about, right? He makes his big spiel. So these rangers were right. So Pathfinder PhD is getting it correct. So they should be less like druids, historically speaking. Yes. Number 2, Jackal Tormoon says Rangers equals Oath of the Crown Paladins, and I don't remember my 5e quite enough, but if those are if those are like the wild paladins, maybe a little bit, but not quite. I'm not sure about the Oath of the Crown. Is that in this book? Will I be able to find it? Maybe not. Let's see here. Paladin. Oath of Devotion. Oath of the Ancients. Oh, that's what I'm thinking. Oath of the Ancients. It's not Oath of the Ancients. All right. I don't know Oath of the Crown. Okay. Yeah. So in that case, I do not think it is like the, Oath of the Ancients is like the Druid Paladins. It wouldn't be that. Okay. These people, the Rangers of Middle Earth didn't care about about the wilderness. They weren't defenders of the wilderness. And I think that's one of the first things to sort of really sort of remind ourselves as we kind of get into this. So let's move over to the first edition Player's Handbook, okay, where we first are introduced to the Ranger. So the first thing that we're going to see when we look to the Ranger is that the Ranger, let's see, here we go. So Rangers start right here. So the Ranger is a subclass of fighter. So even in first edition AD&D, the Ranger and the Paladin were both considered subclasses of the fighter, which essentially meant they were fighters. They had all the same basic abilities of fighters. It's just they also had some additional powers and abilities. So they were, they weren't necessarily inferior to the fighter. In fact, they were far superior to the fighter, but they had all the same powers and abilities. And one of those was that the Ranger in first edition AD&D could use every weapon, and they could use all armor. That was what the fighter got. That literally was like the only ability that the fighter got. Use all armor and use all weapons. And so the Ranger, being a subclass of the fighter, got to do those things too. However, they were adept at woodcraft, tracking, scouting, infiltration, and spying. And again, if we go back to what we know of Rangers from Tolkien, Rangers were consummate fighters, right? They were some of the best in the land. Aragorn is one of the greatest fighters in Middle Earth. These were powerful soldiers capable of holding their own. However, because of their time spent in the wilderness, they had these abilities of woodcraft and tracking. We know Aragorn was a consummate tracker, right? And scout. So, but here we see all Rangers must be of good alignment. The idea, again, is that the Ranger was far closer to a paladin in this era than in our modern day sort of, version of the Ranger. So whereas the paladin was dedicated to a deity and this idea of defeating evil, Rangers were more rooted in like the real world. They were dedicated to people. They were dedicated to keeping people safe from the dangers of the wilderness. However, as befits what is essentially a superpowered godlike being, angelic being, to be a Ranger, you had to have insane stats. Now, keep in mind, this is back in a time when, you were rolling for your stats, but they had to have a strength of at least a 13. They had to have an intelligence of at least 13, a wisdom of 14, and a 14 or greater constitution. Okay? And only if they had a 15 in strength, int, and wisdom or higher did they get a 10% bonus to their experience points. So they were very hard to qualify for. They were a special class. They were like a super power class. They were designed to be very rare, the same way that in Tolkien's world, Rangers and vis-a-vis the Dunedain were a diminished race. They were, very rare. They were not seen together. They would go months without seeing another one of their kinds because their race had been greatly diminished and they covered this vast tract of lands. Benjamin says the Dunedain don't make any damn sense. Elite military unit with zero infrastructure. If they're living like this for centuries, they should look like wood elves. Well, the thing about it is that, remember, Dunedain it's a race first, right? Like the people conflate Dunedain as being this name of the Rangers. Dunedain is actually the name of the race, which literally means the Western men in Sindarin. Okay, so Rangers were an elite class, similar to the Paladin. In fact, I mean, you could run the math on it. I'm sure Paladins were harder to qualify for, but qualifying for a Ranger was considered a very, very difficult feat, and for good reason. So in addition to being a fighter, which meant that they got all weapons and all armors, unlike other fighter types, Rangers have 8-sided hit dice, D8, but at first level, they get 2 hit dice rather than but 1 hit dice. It should also be noted that Rangers get 11 hit dice rather than the 9 of other fighter types. So, what's going on here? Well, the Ranger basically started with more hit dice and more hit points than any of the other classes. And I think 2d10 would have been too much, but by starting with 2d8, and these are hit dice, so you get your constitution bonus for every hit dice. And Rangers need a good constitution. So your constitution hit point bonus might be +2 or +3. A Ranger is going to start with, an average of, let's say, 9 + 6, 15 hit points in a game in an era where your fighter could roll a d10 and get a 2 and might have like 4 hit points. Rangers literally were these like hero level characters, like with a capital H. And they even ended up getting more hit dice than the other classes. So while they were somewhat limited by not being a D10 class, ultimately they ended up having more hit points than any other class, especially if they had a good constitution. However, in addition to their considerable prowess of fighters, Rangers have druidic and magical spell capabilities when they attain high level. Thus, they are very formidable opponents, for they have other abilities and benefits as well. So let's quickly talk about this. Why do Rangers get druidic and magical spell capabilities? So first things first, the Rangers in first edition actually got druid ability spells, but also wizard spells. Now, again, that may seem strange. Where does this come through? Well, the problem, and we'll see this with some of the other abilities, is that at this time and this place, we didn't really have like skill systems exactly. And so if you wanted to give a character an ability to do kind of cool magical things, the way you did that was by giving them access to magic. And not that the Rangers, the Dunedain, were magical. I mean, they definitely had some sort of, kind of quasi-weird magical thing going on with them. But fundamentally, if you wanted your Ranger to have some sort of special ability to like pass without trace or something, the way that they kind of represented this was crudely by giving them druidic capabilities, right? It wasn't about, if you wanted your Ranger to be able to, maybe understand or talk with an animal or something like that, you had to give them a spell, because we didn't have this system where you just like piled on all these different abilities as people went up through the levels as much. So they get these druidic and spell capabilities, but there's a couple of things to note here. At this time in this place, wizards couldn't cast spells while wearing armor, but that's because wizards couldn't wear armor. There was nothing really that said you can't cast spells in armor. So Rangers could cast druid spells and magic user spells while wearing armor. So they were very powerful in that regard. But we'll get to the spellcasting capability in a moment. But this is the first thing that Rangers get, and this is the biggest thing. Now, this ability gets significantly nerfed over the course of the years, and some of it even gets dropped entirely. But this gets back to what we were talking about before about their core existence of the Ranger. When fighting humanoid-type creatures of the giant class, Rangers add 1 hit point for each level of experience they have attained to the points of damage scored whenever they hit in melee combat. I cannot stress enough, this means you're doing +1 point of damage per level. And at this time, in this place, this is not your modern game. Like again, Loth, the demon queen of spiderwebs, she had 66 hit points, 66 hit points. So doing 5 or 10 extra points of damage per attack was craziness. This was an insane amount of damage. Now, the thing is, you might say, oh yeah, against giants, what does that have to do? Well, why they call them giant class creatures, I don't know, but giant class creatures are bugbears, ettins, giants, gnolls, goblins, hobgoblins, kobolds, ogres, ogre magi, orcs, and trolls. So basically, all of the sort of evil humanoid monsters that would inhabit the wildlands, right? Anything that basically had done 2 legs and 2 arms and was evil is something that the ranger was extremely proficient at killing. Because again, this idea was that, as Pathfinder PhD said, the rangers were dedicated to protecting civilization from the predations of these, evil creatures, right? Of Sauron, even though Sauron doesn't exist, right? anymore. Any case, this is a huge amount of damage. And they got this against all these monsters all the time. Now, they didn't get to pick. They weren't like, I'm a hunter of the undead. No, the ranger fought against orcs and goblins and trolls and all the other, humanoid monsters that come down out of the mountains and the dark places of the world and try to destroy cities. That's what they were good at fighting. Secondly, rangers surprise their opponents 50% of the time, and they can only be surprised on a roll of a 1 on a d6. To quote Liv Tyler, what's this? A ranger caught off his guard? Again, we didn't have a skill system. We didn't have perception checks or anything like that. So surprise rolls were just made on a d6, and on a 1 or 2, your character was surprised. Well, rangers surprised their enemies on a 1, 2, or 3, and they themselves were only surprised on a roll of 1. And this is how they represented that in absence of a skill system. Additionally, as is, well documented in Lord of the Rings, rangers could track. And again, we didn't have a skill system. So you had this custom bespoke tracking system that you could do. And it was somewhat limited underground, but above ground, you had a 90%, right from the beginning of the game, you had a 90% base chance of a ranger being able to track a creature. You, for every additional creature in the party that you're tracking, you get a 2% bonus. For every 24 hours, you lose 10%. And for every hour of precipitation, you lose 25%. But you could easily see that if, you were tracking a band of Uruk-hai westward across the plain, you might be like, okay, well, your base chance here is, 120% or something, or 130%. So every day that they move ahead of you, you get minus 10%, but you're basically going to auto track. And rangers were really, really good at this. Okay. At 8th level, the rangers gain a limited druidic spell ability. And at 9th level, they gain a limited magical user spell ability, as with the druidic ability. Now, to be note, they cannot read druid or magic user spells from scrolls in any event. And again, this gets back to what I was saying before. They didn't want them to be like spell casters, like with scrolls and all this other stuff. Instead, they wanted them to have these kind of, today we might call them extraordinary abilities, right? Or like a spell-like ability. It wasn't that they were magical. It's just that the way that the game represented these incredible abilities that some of these characters had in the books and in the novels and in the history of Middle-earth was by just giving them some druid and magic user spells. And I should point out, as we scroll down here, where are you at? Here we go. Rangers did not get a lot of spells, okay? At 8th level, they got 1 druid spell. By the time they reached 17th level, they had two first, second, and third level spells and 2 first and second level magic user spells. Okay, Rangers were not throwing fireballs. They were not throwing fire seeds. They were doing these very low level magic user abilities that, while definitely magical in the context of D&D, they were mostly an attempt to sort of translate these almost magical-like abilities that some of these characters have shown in the novelizations. So it's a very, very limited ability. But there's nothing more proof that these magical powers are strictly designed to emulate Tolkien than this random ability right here. Now, we said that at 8th level, they gained a limited druidic ability. Okay. We see that. And then at 9th level, they gain a limited magic user. Magic user means wizard, by the way, if you didn't watch our wizard. So back then, magic user meant wizard. That's what they were called. They were called magic user. All right. Now, you ready for this? All right. I'm challenging chat. Let's see who the first person can get this. At 10th level, now remember, every level had different level titles, right? So at 10th level, or 11th level rather, you became a ranger. No, sorry. At 10th level, you became a ranger lord. This was kind of called name level. This is where you became like, the king of rangers. At 10th level, a ranger lord, rangers are able to employ, there we go, sorry. At 10th level, ranger lord rangers are able to employ all non-written magic items, so no scrolls, but non-written magic items, which pertain to clairaudience, clairvoyance, ESP, and telepathy. All right, in chat, what the fuck is this ability? There's a correct answer. All right, excellent. You guys, Kendall got that really, really, really great fast, and Omen Owl kind of followed up with the secondary part, which is they're talking about using the Palantir, and specifically in D&D, the Palantir is just the crystal ball item. And the crystal ball magical item lets you, talk through the crystal ball. It lets you view things through the crystal ball. And that is a magic item that in D&D terms cannot be used except for by a magic user, aka a wizard. Well, the ranger gets the ability. Now, of course, technically they can use all non-written magic items that pertain to clairaudience, clairvoyance, ESP, and telepathy. But spoiler alert, the only item that this really applies to in the entire first edition AD&D game is the crystal ball. And it's because the crystal ball is the Palantir. So they literally gave, and by the way, Ranger Lord, right? When Aragorn becomes king, when he goes to Gondor, right? He picks up the Palantir and he confronts Sauron and tells him, I have assumed the throne of Gondor, right? I'm coming for you. So this is like a more of an end game Ranger ability, okay? Well, they want to cover all their bases, George. So, I mean, this is clearly an example of this is designed to be, an homage to Aragorn and the character of Tolkien. And lastly, this is even a more subtler one. Also at 10th level, because now you're the Ranger Lord, you're the Ranger Captain. You attract a body of 2 to 24 followers. Note that these henchmen, once lost, can never be replaced, although mercenaries can be hired. These followers are determined by the DM, who then informs the Ranger. So this is a subtler one, but if you've read your Return of the King, because this isn't in the book, this isn't in the movie, at the end of Return of the King, when Aragorn goes to the paths of the dead, he goes with the Grey Company. And basically, it's his loyal band of Dunedain followers, right? Fighters and paladins, they get, vast armies. But what Aragorn brings with him to the Battle of Pelennor Fields and to the Corsairs of Umbar is his personal crew. Now, Omen Owl says you can get brass dragons and other cool monsters for a ranger. Not till 2nd edition. That's a 2nd edition thing. In 1st edition, the idea is that you were getting your other cool ranger buddies, right, that were coming, or your loyal followers, because again, it's really emulating the Grey Company, which is again that group of rangers that goes with Aragorn to the paths of the dead and fights through the thing. The 1st edition DMG has a list. Okay, I thought it was only a 2nd edition thing, but I will believe you. So here we go. If you ever become not good, you lose all your ranger benefits and you forever become a fighter. And you can never not only that, you're a shitty fighter because you're a fighter with 8 hit dice or 8-sided hit dice, and you can never regain ranger status. Okay. So there's an idea here. This is not just a guy who lives in the woods. This is not just a lady who's good with the bow. This is a noble oath quest. Your powers are coming from being part of this ancient tradition, right? You gave your oath. You are following the oath of Elendil, right? Which I said at the beginning in Sindarin. Actually, I think it's Quenya. Actually, it is Quenya. But anyways, it's not Sindarin, it's Quenya. But anyways, you are the same way paladins can fall. Hell, but paladins can atone. Rangers cannot. If you ever betray your oath, you are no longer a ranger. So that tells us that these powers and these abilities that we've been reading, like being able, all this stuff. There's almost a magical nature to this. It's that kind of in between. It's not overt magical. It's just like Tolkien, right? The magic is much more subtler. Hell, you can't even have servants or henchmen until you get at least 8th level, right? You have to do it on your own, and you can't even have, not that this would ever happen because of the dice roll percentages, no more than 3 rangers may ever operate together at any one time, right? You're too rare and special to be concentrated in one space. And lastly, similar to the paladin, we saw this before in first edition with the paladin and in later editions, rangers may own only those goods and treasures which they can carry on their person and or place upon their mount. All excess must be donated to a worthy communal or institutional cause, but never to another player character. See Paladin above. So, and here's our final. And by the way, look at the names, okay, for the ranger. A level 2 ranger is known as Strider. And then a scout, a courser, a tracker, a guide, a pathfinder, a ranger, ranger knight, and then finally ranger lord. So, again, yes, this is cool if you want to LARP as Aragorn, I suppose. So the fundamental idea of the ranger, again, remember, it was a subclass of the fighter. So the idea was that, hey, Aragorn and the other Dunedain are just fighters, okay? But they also have these kind of cool, wilderness abilities, these kind of pseudo-magical abilities, because they're actually, to be a ranger in Tolkien's world, a ranger of the North, also means that your ancestry is sort of supercharged mega-human, known as a Dunedain, blessed by the Valar. These people also, Aragorn isn't the only one that lives to be 175 years old, right? His entire race lives that long. They have this noble stature that none others can approach. Okay. Now, that was the first edition Ranger, and it was very clearly an homage to the Aragorn. You'll note that there's nothing about dual wielding. There's nothing about bows. Okay. By the way, look at this. Remember with this awesome damage bonus? I can't even tell you. This is an insane amount of damage for first edition AD&D. When fighting humanoid creatures of the giant class, which remember includes orcs and goblins, they add 1 hit point for each level of experience they obtain to the points of damage scored when they hit in melee combat. So Rangers didn't even get to use their cool damage bonus with a ranged shot. Now, they were proficient in bows, of course, because they were a fighter subclass, so they were proficient in all weapons. But yes, you're talking about a game where even at high levels, like a high-level fighter, unless they found like a belt of giant strength or something, might be doing, D8 plus 7 damage or something, at high level, D8 plus 7, D8 plus 8. A 10th level ranger would be doing D8 plus 10 base damage, plus their strength, plus their magical bonus. So it's like D8 plus 17 or something. It's just a crazy amount of, of doth. So anyways, the ranger was not, had nothing to do with ranged combat. In fact, just the opposite. Very much not ranged combat. And they also had nothing to do with like protecting the woods from people. Nope. They were protecting people from the woods. And they had nothing to do with bows. You'll also notice nothing to do with animals or animal companions. They had nothing to do with pets. Aragorn didn't have a pet. So the original Ranger class was based off of the Aragorn Ranger, which is based off of the Dunedain, which goes back to Tolkien. Okay? Someone asked, what class is Legolas? Fighter. As well he should be. Mindblood says Legolas is an elf. That's actually a bad comparison, because if we talk about basic D&D where elf was a class, elves could cast magic spells, and Legolas very clearly could not cast magic spells. Okay. So this comes out 1979, 1978, and we have this for about 10 years. And then 1989, late 1989 comes around, and we get the second edition of the Player's Handbook. Now, a lot has happened in the intervening 10 years between that book and this book. The 80s have happened. So, first thing that we should know is that generically, the association between D&D and Tolkien had become much less severe. As is famously noted, when Dungeons & Dragons first came out, the class that we know as, or the race that we know as the Halfling, was actually called the Hobbit. They were sued by Tolkien to not use the Hobbit, okay? And so they had to change it to Halfling. So the original D&D had a much stronger, deeper connection to the, sort of Tolkien-esque inspiration. However, you also saw the game, I think, start to get a little bit away from some of those heroic, high fantasy roots over time as well. But in the 80s, two really important things happened. The first came out in 1984 when a book was published called Dragons of Autumn Twilight. Now, this is on my thumbnail. Dragons of Autumn Twilight features the companions of the heroes of the Lance, the companions of the Lance. And this is the Dragonlance series of novels. And arguably one of the more main characters, it's arguably the leader of the Dragonlance, is called Tanis Half-Elven. And Tanis Half-Elven is basically an Aragorn clone. Sorry, Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, but Tanis is literally an Aragorn clone, even to the point where him being half-elves are very rare in Dragonlance. Technically Aragorn, being a descendant of Elros was half-elven. So there's this idea that Aragorn even has elven blood in him. In fact, he's related to Arwen, right? Arwen's dad was the brother, Elrond. Arwen's dad, Elrond, was the brother of Elros, from whom Aragorn is descended. So number one, you had Tanis, who came out in 1984, and it was sort of more of an homage to that classic good guy ranger trope. But Tanis sort of, in my opinion, sort of combined Legolas with Aragorn. Well, the first Dragonlance book was designed to basically make a D&D Lord of the Rings. So, they did this kind of deliberately. But Tanis sort of took elements from Legolas, who was an elf, and Aragorn, who was a ranger. And Tanis Half-Elven was born, right? He has a beard. And as a result, Tanis used his bow a lot more than Aragorn ever really did. And so this idea of the bow ranger sort of entered into the lexicon. But I should note, in second edition, we're still not there yet. What has a much larger influence, in my personal opinion. Now, some people, like David Zeb Cook, who is the author of this book, have said, I don't really recall it being a major influence on the game. However, I disagree. Because this book was being created this book came out in 1989, late 1989. And TSR, who created this book, was working on this edition during a time where they were also developing their novel product lines. And they were working with a new author named R.A. Salvatore, and he developed and designed a new series called the Icewind Dale Trilogy. And the first book of this was called The Crystal Shard. It's one of my favorite, kind of YA early fantasy novels. And it was designed to be what's the word I'm looking for? An ensemble series where you had the Companions of the Hall. You had, Brunor Battlehammer and Wulfgar and Regis the Halfling and Dritz Duerden. And it was supposed to be, again, an ensemble, but like, I don't know, Steve Urkel or Sheldon from Big Bang Theory, right? Dritz was the breakout star. And at that time, in the 80s, right, every decade has its, edgelord, anti-hero, I'm too cool for school, go-to race. And in the late 70s, early 80s, you had these books come out, which were called Against the Giants. famous series of adventure modules, G1, G2, G3, in which you fight hill giants, and then you fight fire giants, and then you fight frost giants. And then you discover that the reason the giants were all irritated and up in arms was because they were being manipulated by this newly released race, the Dark Elves, the Drow. And while the Dark Elves were noted in the Monster Manual 1, they didn't really get stats until those final that final G3, because when you go into the it's not the steading of the Frost Giant King. Maybe it is the steading of the Frost Giant. No, it's not steading of the Frost Giant King. Something Frost Giant Jarl or something. Anyways, when you go into the Frost Giant Jarls, there's like this room in the back where you encounter the Drow like ambassador who has been like manipulating the giants, and it's this big deal. Oh my god, a Drow! And they gave stats for them, and then they gave full stats for the Drow in the Fiend Folio, which was a sort of alternate, I call it the edgy monster manual, but it was actually produced in the UK. That's why it has such a different feel. It's very famous for introducing the Githyanki and the Githzari, but it's also the place where we first get actually dedicated information about the Drow. And people, like the way that people love tieflings today for being these kind of dark, edgy, anti-heroes, the Drow were that. They were elves, but they were dark and they were evil, and they had all these cool, powerful, magical abilities that were just like insane. And so people liked the Drow a lot. And that's what people wanted to be. So R.A. Salvatore includes Dritz Duerden as this sort of anti-hero, shunned, exiled Drow, nobody understands me character. And he became this sort of breakout star of the series. And of course, after the Icewind Dale series was completed by the early 90s, he went back and wrote a prequel series called called the Dark Elf Trilogy, which was Homeland and things like that. Jackal Tormoon says Ambassador Divin, and that is a deep cut. That is an EverQuest deep cut. Well done, Jackal. EverQuest 1. So, anyways, R.A. Salvatore is working on this book, and they're working on the Player's Handbook 2. And I cannot help but believe that the nature of Dritz Duerden influenced what this game was going to make of Rangers. And as a result, what people began to think of Rangers was not so much Tolkien's Aragorn heroic defender of humanity, but instead this kind of dual-wielding ranger elven badass, which is what Dritz Duerden was. There's only 17 problems with that. Okay, the problem number one is drow elves in their description from the Fiend Folio are described. You got the drow here. Look at this. Here we go. The drow elf. This is from the Fiend Folio. By the way, you got to love these old books. Number appearing 5 to 50. Number one of the reasons I became good at, not arguably became good at stats, is like I grew up reading these books. They never told you what 5 to 50 generated. I know now we probably look at that. Well, hopefully you look at that and you go, oh, that's 5d10. 5d10 produces a range of 5 to 50. But back in the day, like I didn't know that. Like some things would say like 4 to 32. And I had to be like, oh, what's 4 to 32? You're like, oh, it's 4d8. Anyways, so these were the drow elves, and they were included, and they had 50% magic resistance, and they had all these awesome abilities and all this other cool stuff, and they're, whatever, very powerful. Drow males are fighters. They can be magic users. The priests, the females are priestess and clerics, and all their weapons are magical, super magical, but of course it decays in the sunlight. And here we have this important thing here. In addition, they arm themselves with long dagger and short sword of adamantite alloy. +1 to as high as +3 or even +4, borne by the noble folk. So drow innately sort of were presented in the monster manual as dual wielding. This was further cemented by Dritz Duerden, who for the vast majority of his very long life was very clearly a fighter. And growing up, his father, who trained him, was a fighter, one of the greatest fighters. He notes that Dritz is particularly ambidextrous. He calls him, his nickname for Dritz is Two Hands. Dritz learns from his great father / mentor, Zach Nafine, how to dual wield weapons, scimitars. He then goes to the fighter school of Menzo Baranzan called Melee Magfair. And there he trains as a fighter to be fighter. And he does all these things. And then he's banished from, he gets exiled from his homeland, and he eventually makes his way to the surface. He meets a ranger by the name of Mushi, and it's really more of a spiritual awakening for him, because when you go back to those early Dritz novels, Dritz isn't really a ranger. He doesn't cast any spells other than his innate drow abilities. He doesn't have an animal companion. But Derek, what about Guinevere? Well, Guinevere isn't an animal companion. Guinevere is a figurine of wondrous power. It's a magical item. It's not even an animal companion. It's an intelligent panther from the astral plane that's summoned from a small statuette. So all these assumptions that people have of Dritz, they think, oh, Dritz, dual wielding, animal companions, that's a ranger, have absolutely nothing to do with the ranger. They have everything to do with Dritz being a, twinked out, powerful, magical item holding drow fighter who is just really good at 2-weapon wielding. And he's the first. He's Guinevere, I choose you, and just throws it. We do not really see Dritz doing any sort of what I would call ranger magic or ranger stuff until much, much later. In fact, the only thing that Mushi really teaches Dritz, who has spent his life in the Underdark, is about, plants and animals and how to track and, that kind of thing. And Mushi's blind, so, arguably, I'm sure that was more of a theoretical education. In fact, yes, Joe Russell brings up an excellent point. If we go to the excellent, did I put it away? I must have put it away. To the excellent 3rd edition Forgotten Realms campaign setting, the way 3rd edition was supposed to work is you gained levels that sort of representing the story of your character. So Dritz starts off with 10 levels of fighter. Then he gains 1 level of barbarian because he spends like a decade or more just living as a sort of feral being in the Underdark. And this is the book Exile. It's the 2nd book of the Dark Elf trilogy. And then he only picks up a couple of levels of ranger. And so, point is, he's more of a fighter than he is anything else. But he was very popular. And as a result of this, people didn't care about that back then. It was about the story, Jackal. As a result of this, we come to D&D 2nd edition. And now we have a very different set of qualifications for the ranger. Now, the ranger is still a subclass of the fighter, it's a part of the warrior class. And we can see here that the ranger still requires very high ability scores, a 13 in strength, a 13 in dex, a 14 in con, and a 14 in wisdom. So still requires very high stats. Is still considered to be a very powerful character. However, he's become more in line with some of the other classes. Gone is the bonus hit points. He now just gets the same D10s as the fighter and the paladin. He caps at 9 hit dice instead of 11 hit dice. So you need all these really cool, powerful stats, but you don't really get anything from that perspective. And then we get to the ranger. Now you'll note, we skipped over this in 1st edition, by the way, but in 1st edition, just like in 2nd edition, rangers could only be humans, elves, and half-elves, which again goes right back to that sort of Tolkien-based nature where the Dunedain were basically human half-elf type people. So, we have that ability. Now, the ranger is a hunter and woodsman who lives by not only his sword, but his wits. Robin Hood, Orion, Jack the Giant Killer, and the Huntresses of Diana are examples of rangers from history and legend. The abilities make him particularly good at tracking, woodcraft, and spying, and I disagree with this entirely, because Robin Hood is a fighter who lives in the woods. Hell, he only lives in the woods because he's an outlaw. He has a bow, but what does that have to do with being a ranger? In fact, even in this version of the game, 2nd edition, rangers aren't anything special with bows. like at all. If anything, Robin Hood is, he's a fighter who picked up rogue levels, if anything. Orion, the hunter, he doesn't cast druid spells. He's just a really good hunter. It's just a fighter. He's just a fighter. Now, here's the problem. The problem is at this point in D&D, classes had to do all the heavy lifting because we did not have an integrated horizontal silo of skills that we could apply these ranger-like tendencies to. You see, in modern day parlance, we would just have a fighter who picked up, animal lore or forest lore or move, stealth or any of these, tracking, survival, any of these things that today we associate as a skill would have just been given to a fighter, and you could just make a quote-unquote woodsman by having a fighter rogue and giving them some proficiency and training in some of the wilderness skills or picking up a wilderness feat, okay? But we didn't have a skill system. We had non-weapon proficiencies. They were optional. They certainly didn't exist in first edition. Non-weapon proficiencies were very limited. They were an optional system. So we didn't have this very robust, richly developed skill system that we have in, say, 5th edition or Pathfinder 2 today. And that means that if you wanted to have a warrior who had abilities like moving and hiding quietly in shadows and being able to track, you had to make it a new class. In fact, the ranger, right, he gets hide in shadows and move silently as a thief percentage, right? But why? Well, because we didn't have the stealth skill. Right now, this whole thing would just be replaced with stealth skill. So the first problem we have is that they don't have a way to do this, so they have to give the rangers these special weird abilities. Now, secondly, we've moved now away from this ranger thing, from the concept of the wilderness warrior, to more of this sort of lightly armored skirmisher, basically druid-warrior. And now we can see that while the rangers still have to be good, they the same as before, they still have to be good, but so we're sort of mixing the message here, because now they're very clearly not the Tolkien ranger, but they still need to be good, and it's not entirely clear why. I mean, like none of these things talk about being like a defender of the the bastions of men and elfin kind, but anyways, so. Rangers, this is where we get to the beginning of you can do anything you want, except you really can't. Rangers can use any weapon and any armor, but they can only use their special abilities when they're wearing studded leather or light armor. So yes, a ranger could wear full plate, but they don't get their bonuses when they're not in studded leather or lighter armor. So again, we're moving more towards that lightly armored Dritz ideal. While wearing studded leather or lighter armor, in other words, when you're dressed up like druid-warrior, a ranger can fight two-handed with no penalty to his attack rolls. Where did that come from? I concur. I argue that it came from druid-warrior. And it came from this idea of turning this person from a warrior against the forces of chaos and evil to this kind of like, this like skirmishing druid-warrior duelist person in the woods. They are a skilled woodsman, even if you are not using the proficiency rules. They have the tracking proficiency. If you are using them, they gain the ability to track, and they get a bonus depending on their level. Also, while wearing studded leather or lighter armor, they can move silently and hide in shadows. So fundamentally, what we have here is a fighter who got the dual wield feat for free, and in D&D terms would have, the stealth skill and the tracking skill. That's it. There's nothing like special or magical or whatever about it anymore. But it continues to go on here. Now, here's where we start to get away from that Tolkien idea, but the idea of the rangers being a defender stays, but it's lost that connection. It's lost that meaning. In their roles as protectors of good, which is again kind of getting a little murky now, rangers tend to focus their efforts against some particular creature, usually one that marauds their homeland. Before advancing to second level, rangers must select a species. Typical species include giants, orcs, lizardmen, trolls, or ghouls. Your DM has the final approval. Thereafter, whenever you encounter that enemy, you get a +4 bonus to your attack rolls against that enemy. But note, no longer is it, just the enemies of the civilized people. Instead, the free people of Middle-earth, now it's just trolls. It's just orcs. So it's become much more weirdly specific. Instead of being this sort of generic bastion against all things evil, we've now become more of this like focused, targeted, dare I say, hunter. Furthermore, the ranger will actively seek out this enemy in combat in preference to all other foes unless someone else presents a much greater danger. It's not really included here about what the mechanical penalty of this is, but it's just highly encouraged, right? That your character focuses in on their enemy. We also now start to get this ability that they have an adept understanding with animal creatures. Now, again, I think there's some blurring of the lines here. Aragorn was good with, like, for example, talking to a horse, but it had nothing to do with him being a ranger. It had everything to him with him knowing Elvish. The power of being able to calm a wild stallion actually has nothing to do with ranger. It has everything to do with the power of the elven speech, and just knowing Elven is enough to sort of have this almost magical quality to the world. However, so that may be part of it. They're like, wasn't Aragorn good with animals? No, he just knew Elvish. But also, people started confusing rangers with Dritz and with Guinevere and needing an animal companion. So you start getting the beginning of these animal type stuff. And we can see now here that the ranger's followers can be everything from a black bear to a brown bear to a tree ant to a pixie. And we're moving away from the ranger being a wilderness warrior who fights against the wilderness to sort of more being like, I'm a friend of the trees. I'm a friend of the woods. In some ways, this ranger is the weirdest and the weakest, obviously, because it's just a complete stripped down version of the original awesome first edition ranger with all the same restrictions. You still need these insane ability scores. You still need to be good alignment. You lose the ability to cast magic user spells. You get a little bit more powerful. And by the way, it says priest spells, but really this is the sphere system from second edition. So you can only cast spells from the animal and plants domain. But gone are the abilities to use crystal balls, right? We've moved away from that. And instead what we're getting is this kind of like milk toast quasi, druidic paladin, which I think is, pretty lame. So that is the end of that ranger. And that brings us to third edition. All right. So here is our third edition ranger. Milk toast quasi druidic paladin. Tell us how you really feel. That's correct. Now, level 2 janitor says, I think compared to the first edition ranger, this looks like a huge improvement in terms of being thematically coherent. Well, it depends on what, I would agree with you, level 2 janitor. If we are moving away from the idea of the ranger as this sort of like, yes, just Aragorn, basically. And we're moving towards a sort of wilderness warrior in the sense of like, I'm the melee version of a druid. I'm totally understandable. In fact, I would agree with that, except for the dual wielding. That doesn't really make any sense and doesn't really come out of anywhere. But they basically get more druid spells. They get more of an ability to interact with animals. They get the ability to move silently high. They're more lightly armored, which all makes sense for something that would, be living in the wilderness and doing all these wildernessy things. If we're moving away from the Aragorn thing, which is fine, but they add this dual wielding thing because of Dritz, and I argue, even though it's been said that it's not. So we get to third edition, and right off the bat, third edition has made so now we have 11 years later, we get third edition. At this point, we've had, the launch of countless video games and countless, action RPGs and all this other stuff. And the Ranger is now in an extremely weird spot because they're just a fighter that dual wields and tracks and sometimes casts druid spells. It's a very strange place to be in. It doesn't make any sense. And one of the first things that we can see here with the third edition Ranger is its alignment. It is any. So now our Ranger has been completely divorced from this heroic defender of the people and is now very firmly kind of just like I don't even know, just a fighter who lives in the woods. I mean, for lack of a better word, it really is in my opinion, a pointless class. It has no bearing and point. And in fact, if we look at the class, you got 20 levels of classes. You get track, which is a feat, by the way. Anyone can take. It is just a feat in third edition. Okay. I don't know if this is actually hyperlinked. Doesn't appear to be. Anyone can take it. It uses your wilderness lore skill, I think is what it's called. Anyways, they just get a feat for free. Now, of course, at this time in this place, you only got like 6 or 7 feats, over the course of the game. But it's literally just a feat. It doesn't really do much. Okay. And now we have a skill system. So the Ranger got, access to a couple skills that a fighter wouldn't get access to, right? They get access to move silently and they get access to hide, right? They get access to wilderness lore and of course use rope. But fundamentally, I mean, it is just a bunch of skills. I mean, it's a fighter with slightly better skills. Now they get proficiency. Again, you can see how the things change from each edition, but then some things stay behind. They are still proficient with simple martial weapons, light armor, medium armor, shields. We've lost heavy armor completely. But even though we are proficient with medium armor and we could wear it, we never will, because when we are wearing light armor or no armor, we can fight with 2 weapons as if he or she had the ambidexterity and 2-weapon fighting. You lose the special bonus if in heavy or medium armor, or if you use a double-handed weapon, such as a double sword. Got to be 2 weapons. Now note, there is nothing in here about bows at all. The Ranger in 3rd edition is a lightly armored guy with I guess an okay skill list who lives in the woods and at 4th level gains 0 first level druid spells. We also get favored enemies. And the way this works is you pick an enemy and you get +1 to bluff, listen, sense motive, spot, and wilderness lords check. And you get the same bonus to damage. Okay. You also get the bonus to range damage, which is new, but only if you're within 30 feet. It doesn't apply against creatures that are immune to critical hits. So it doesn't do anything against undead, and it doesn't do anything against constructs. Every 5 levels, you get to pick a new one. And so by the end of the game, the first one that you picked will be at +5. So if you pick like Goblin or Orc as your first one, thinking, oh, that'll be good, that's the one I'm going to most likely use at first level. That's the one that'll be the most powerful by the time you're at the end of the game and it doesn't actually do anything. Whereas like the demon or devil, which you picked up at like level 15 or level 20, will only be +1. So really you should take like dragon or demon as your first one, even though you're probably not going to fight one for a very, very long time. It's a horrendous class. And not only that, because of the way multiclassing worked in 3rd edition, if you took 1 level of Ranger, you got the track ability, you got your favored enemy. You got track for free. You picked up +1 BAB. You picked up +2 to fort. You picked up a favored enemy, which was whatever. But you also picked up all of its abilities. So you picked up the ability to have ambidexterity, and you had the ability to 2-weapon fight. So you got a lot of bonus if you wanted to dual wield, basically. So 3E was lousy for 1-level dips, but even outside of that, this is just a boring, horrible class because it's literally defined by dual wielding, which is something that the fighter could do too. And it does some extra damage to some monsters, but the fighter could just take weapon specialization and just do extra damage to all monsters. And yes, eventually they get now we've taken the spells, which used to be sort of the purview of the high level Ranger. And now we've brought them down to level 4. And so now the ranger has moved completely away from, in my opinion, the martial Aragorn ranger, which had this very limited spell-like ability. And now they're really trying to make it the sort of druid hybrid class, right? It's the druid fighter. But I think it sucks at both, and I don't think it's particularly interesting in any capacity. The spells you get are limited and weak, and there's no flavor to this class. It's trying to be two things at once. Are you a wilderness warrior or are you a weird hybrid spellcaster? You're no longer tied to this idea of being a defender of good, so you're more of like this focused hunter, right? Because you've got your favorite enemy and track. Okay, so I'm a hunter. But then why do I dual wield? What sort of hunter dual wields? Can you imagine being like, yeah, I'm a hunter of demons, and I'm a hunter of terrible beasts in the wilderness. What do you use? I use 2 swords. You'd be like, what? That's the dumbest thing ever. Now, they're also making them more magical, but it's still really weak magic, and it doesn't really feel like it does anything. So all in all, I think it's pretty bad for 3rd edition. Now, so that brings us to 3.5. So just 3 years later, we get a whole new edition of the game, and we get the Ranger. So what happens to our Ranger in this edition of the game? Thank you for your advertisement. I don't know if I can make that go away. So our Ranger now, look at this stupid thing. Oh man, just going to keep playing. All right, whatever. We'll just deal with it. So our Ranger now in 3rd edition is down to D8. Okay. And the abilities, I can't zoom in without zooming in on this stupid thing. Oh my God. D20srd.org. What is wrong with you? We've now split up the abilities so that you don't get the combat style at level 1. Okay. You get it at level 2. And your favorite enemy, you still get favorite enemy track, but we also now are very much aligned with this idea of, the Ranger is this like hunter druid class that has this ability to like cast druid spells. It now has the ability to affect wild empathy. So they have a magical sort of pseudo ability, kind of magical, to empathize with animals and built in. And so suddenly we have this existence of this animal companion, which we get for the first time ever in 3.5. This did not exist in 3.0 at 4th level. And now the Ranger is basically we've completed the transformation to what would become the WoW Hunter, okay? Which is we're a magical class, just like the WoW Hunter. I'm thinking vanilla WoW here, okay? Well, no, but see, this is just it. We've kind of given up on Dritz, George, because now, because of the way that the game has changed, we've bastardized every element of it, okay? We've bastardized every element of it because we took Guinevere and then we made it into like, the Ranger has these pets, and that now we formalized it. And so now we have druid spells, so we're magical. We have an animal companion, which we get at 4th level. But then we also now get a combat style. So now, now the Ranger can pick between dual wielding weapons or archery. Why? Well, nobody's really sure, but most of it is because people began, I think, to think of the Ranger as this hunter type character. And when you think of a hunter type character, you think of, someone with a ranged weapon with a bow, and maybe they have their, hunting companion, their dog or whatever. And the Ranger, in order to make it function as this kind of wilderness class, it starts getting these different abilities that they spread out throughout the course of the game. So it gains the ability to move, similar to a druid. They get these abilities to move through undergrowth without it affecting you. You get the ability to blend into natural surroundings with a camouflage. So the Ranger here is this weird, magical, strange combination of abilities. Not to mention that the whole abilities that you get for dealing with magical terrain, or, the wilderness, is basically, it just doesn't affect you. The woodland stride, it doesn't affect you. The endurance, getting tired doesn't affect you. And then most of the class, the combat style, the improved combat style, the combat style mastery are just bonus feats. The fighter class literally gets these every 2 levels. And we have a lower hit die. So we're a fighter with skills, but we also have druid spells. And then here's an animal companion, which was a druid's thing, but it's now like the ranger's thing. So you're just like a bad druid and a bad fighter at the same time. And you don't really have anything that's uniquely yours. Like, you could track, but so can anybody who takes the feat. You have wild empathy, but so does any druid. You have animal companion, but so does any druid, and the druids is better. The only thing you get is this idea that against very limited number of monsters, you have your favorite enemy. Now, in 3.5, they doubled it from +1 to +2. So your favorite enemy is now +2 damage, +4 damage, etc., etc. But even still, outside of fighting one of those very specific monsters, you're not really doing a whole lot else. But we've added this ability for bows, but not really sure why that is. And there's this kind of weird, cross-pollination happening here. Because if the ranger is more of a hunter, but don't we think of the hunter as being kind of like, not necessarily against nature, but they're definitely not like good for nature, right? like the person hunter, and you're like, no, I hunt, my favorite enemies. And so now the ranger is more of like they're almost like an assassin, right? They're like tracking down these enemies and killing them. And it's completely lost any sort of touch to its original basis. It's all over the place. It's crazy. And it has, just really nothing going on. Now, that was 2003. And of course, in 2004, World of Warcraft launches, I'm sure influenced in part by D&D, of course. And we get the Hunter class. And the Hunter class is a ranged class that uses a bow or a gun. And they have magical abilities to mark their targets. Hey, Dr. Metropolis coming in here.
DR Metropolis tipped $5. The WoW Hunter was not supposed to use mana or be magical. Hunters originally had focus as a resource in the beta, but the system was not fully developed and was later replaced with mana shortly before the game's launch. Focus was later reintroduced.
Yeah, I know that the Hunter in WoW has gone through several indications. The original Hunter had a mana bar and was a spellcaster, and they were ranged attack, and they had a pet, an animal companion, that they were a pet class. And they also had things that felt very huntery, like traps and all this other stuff. And they were a damage dealing class. Whereas before, the Ranger had been a warrior class, right? And so now they were more on this damage dealing side. Now, we're not gonna get too deep into the woods on 4th edition. But let me bring it up here. But when 4th edition came out in 2008, obviously World of Warcraft had been out for a while. And I think, to their credit, which I know people do not like to give them credit for. Jesus Christ, where's my... Here we go. Player's Handbook. Here we go. Okay. I had to bring up my Player's Handbook. The 4th edition Ranger made a stunning departure. Okay. And the stunning departure for the 4th edition Ranger is that they got rid of their spell casting entirely. Okay. They were a martial class. Their talents depended on extensive training, practice, inner confidence, and proficiency. The Ranger became a martial character. Actually, 4E did not have the WoW Ranger, because the 4E Ranger was not magical, nor was it a pet class. All right. Now, again, we're still left with the defining legacy of Dungeons and Dragons has been, what is even going on here? Because the idea of the Ranger was, okay, so what are they going to do here? Now, in 3.5, the Ranger went down to D8 hit die. So they really weren't, and they were wearing light armor. They weren't wearing heavy armor anymore, right? So you had a D8 hit die class. You had light armor. You had a character that got damage bonuses, right? Their favored enemy gave them damage bonuses. 2-weapon fighting let them make more attacks, so they were doing more damage. And so when they came to the Ranger in 2008, and they also look at World of Warcraft. In World of Warcraft, you had the Hunter, who was a damage dealer, and they said, okay, well, Rangers are not going to be a, warrior anymore. They're not a defender. They're not a, they started off as this like, impenetrable defender of the human species. There's these great guardians of the people. Now they were pew, pew, pew DPS. And this is why I both loathe and love the 4th edition Ranger, because they got rid of everything about the Ranger and they just made it pew, 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 pew DPS. And that pew, 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 pew could either be you doing this, because why not? We kept the 2 weapons. At this point, it's baked in, but also ping, ding, 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 bow, 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 bow. And inexplicably, unbelievably, when you pick a Ranger in 4th edition, you can either be an archer style or a 2-blade fighting style. So yes, somehow this class is either like super range or super melee with 2 weapons. It doesn't really ever make any sort of sense, but this Ranger was all about the damage. And we kept now with this Hunter Quarry where they, could pick one target and hone in on them with their Hunter's mark, if you will, and they did extra damage. And what is interesting, what stands out about this is the Ranger was very broken. It was one of the highest damage dealing classes in the game. I think it was incredibly boring, and it was very powerful and was very effective. And in my 4th edition campaign, we had a Ranger go all the way up to 30th level, and it was extremely powerful. Yes, the at-will ability, Twin Strike, is probably one of, if not one of the greatest at-will spells in the game, or at-will powers in the game, just because of the way the damage stacking worked in 4th edition. All of their abilities to do multiple attacks was very, very powerful. And, and I can't speak to any of the classes that came out super late. I know that Essentials had a Hunter that made it a little bit more druidic, and all this other stuff. But the Ranger just basically became about shooting people and doing damage. It lost any connection to that Aragorn Ranger. It lost any connection to that magical nature of being defending, the wilderness and tied to this and all this other things. It had, a handful of skills, and that was it. Gone was, tracking. Gone was animal empathy, which was great because that stuff didn't really make any sense. But in return, they replaced it with something that was just, I think, very flavorless. And it was just literally a damage spamming class. So it was, yeah, that's true. It was basically 2 classes, but they just shared the utility powers, because you either took the melee power, attack power, or you took the, the whatever power. Now, yes, they have animal-themed names. You are correct about that. Oh, it is the dire Wolverine strike. You're like, oh, do I turn into a Wolverine? Do I summon a Wolverine? No, but you slash at them with the ferocity of a wounded dire Wolverine, and you get to attack every enemy in burst. So here's our Martial Ranger. And it just is like boring. I couldn't, this is just now in the 4th edition lexicon, this is a striker, right? Because in 4th edition, you have these roles. And so, if the fighter is the defender and is designed to have high hit points and high AC and mark people and, do the defending stuff, then you can't also have the fighter be the damage dealer, because that wouldn't be fair. Now, they did that a little bit later, and I don't like that they mixed roles when they introduced the Slayer, because I didn't like mixing roles and classes. I'm thumbs down on that for 4th edition. Yet another reason I don't like the Essentials. But they created the wolf, the ranger, and they made it really boring. Now the rogue is damage dealing, but the rogue, in my opinion, is a lot better because the rogue has a lot more skill elements to it and is a little bit more tactically interesting and definitely has a different feel than the ranger, who is just sort of a sentry gun who just stands there and pew 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 pews or just runs in and goes and just zergs attacks. And it's just damage. And for me, it's just such a falling from where it once was, and it just shows how people ruin everything, and they just create the most sort of boring version of a class, eventually. So that was, rather disappointing, to say the least. And that brings us to the 5th edition Ranger. So, by and large, 4th edition is considered a failure. And so, what did Wizards of the Coast do? They took 2 or 3 big fucking steps backwards. Okay? And they said, hey, look, you guys didn't like 4th edition, so here you go. Here's a D10 Ranger who has proficiency in weapons and armor, and they get druidic spells. How about you start getting them earlier now? You get them at level 2. And by the way, they'll go up to level 5. So we made them more magical. And we'll give them a bunch of like pseudo magical wilderness abilities. But also you get a fighting style, and you can be archery, or you can be do 2-weapon fighting, or how about great weapon fighting, or protection, or just any of the options that people can choose. Okay, but you chose this because you want to deal with the wilderness. All right, great. So here's what we're going to do. How about once you get to level 1, you get a type. I'm trying to see how often you get these. You get natural at level 1, level 6, level 10, like every 4 or 5 levels. Pick a terrain type and just never interact with that terrain ever again, because you can't get lost. You don't get slowed down. You always remain alert. You always track creatures. You get double the amount of food that you would need. And if you're traveling alone, you can move stealthily. Basically, completely ignore it. Also, your proficiency bonus is doubled. So it's just like insane. And they basically just like took all of the kind of the worst elements of the Ranger and just threw them all back in, somehow by losing even more identity than it lacked before. And they just, this natural explorer thing is so good, it's boring, because now it's just like, hey, pick a terrain. If you're in that terrain, doesn't matter. And if you're outside of that terrain, it does nothing. And then they just say, pick a random style, no particular reason. Oh, and here's a bunch of druid spells. And you get hide in plain sight and vanish, and then that's it. Now you get your subclass, which is you can now choose to be like, hey, did you really like being the DPS? Pew, 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 pew. Great. You can be the hunter. And this is obviously the SRD, so it doesn't have the other ones. Now, I understand that there's a new ranger, and there's a million other rangers, as people are saying in chat here. You know, there's the 5E ranger, the 5E revised ranger, the 5E Tasha's rangers, and now we have the 5E 2024 rangers. But the fundamental problem here is that the 5E ranger, by and large, doesn't fix any of the ranger's core problems, which is that the ranger, it just shouldn't exist as a class. And you know, and again, we can actually here, let's so just to kind of complete the process here. Here's our Pathfinder 2 Ranger. And some believe civilization wears down the soul, but still needs to be protected from wild creatures. Others say nature needs to be protected from the greedy. You could champion either or both. So now the Ranger is basically just like, hey, whatever. Like, oh, are you a defender of civilization against the wild? Be a Ranger. Are you someone who believes that civilization should be protected from the greedy? You know, and that you're basically an eco-terrorist? Oh, be a Ranger. And you're like, well, no, I want to be a martial character. You're like, great, be a Ranger. You're like, but I want to cast druid spells as well. And you're like, cool, be a ranger, because they're both martial only and magic only. Like the ranger in Pathfinder 2nd edition is just a grab bag of just random, inexplicable fucking abilities. And by the way, it wouldn't be the ranger if it wasn't like, hey, choose a hunter's edge. And you're like, oh, what is my edge as a hunter? Oh, I can attack very quickly with 2-weapon melee weapons, or I can attack really well with a bow weapon. It's like still just the most random things ever. And you know, it sucks. I think it sucks. But outwit might be like the most, at least, interesting ability of the Pathfinder 2 Ranger, which is this idea of like you're using your knowledge and your skill and your mastery of this terrain or of this enemy to kind of give you an advantage. And now it's like, okay, well, yeah, but the ranger doesn't get a animal companion. Oh, no, you just take a feat for that. You know, you're like, well, it doesn't have spells. Yeah, you just take a feat for that. And you take the initiate warden and the follow-up warden spells. So this is now just a build your own ranger out of all of the parts of all the different rangers that things. You are correct. Flurry isn't dual weapon though, and I am conflating that with twin takedown. And by and large, most people are going to take twin takedowns. But yes, you are right, Neutromancer. But it's just like a grab bag of just random and let's throw in crossbows because we want people to feel special about crossbows. And nobody, you know, it doesn't do anything. It just doesn't do. And again, even as much as I love the original first edition Ranger, you know, that existed as sort of more of like a weird race class thing. And then because, you know, you needed someone to be the Dunedain, this sort of like defender of the wilderness. But more important than that, we didn't have the sophisticated skill system to create a Robin Hood character. We didn't have the skill system or the feat system to create a fighter who specializes and focuses in, you know, different wilderness oriented abilities and skills. So we had to make it into its own class. But I don't think the class identity there is strong enough to overshadow the core class identity of the fighter. And I will also say, this is more of my opinion, I've always felt like the divide with people with Paladin is much less, like nobody ever says, I want to see a martial Paladin. Everyone agrees that a martial Paladin is just a fighter, right? But we see this with the Ranger. I like martial Ranger. What does that mean? Does that just mean a fighter with a bow? Like, I don't understand why that differentiation occurs between fighter and ranger, or fighter and paladin, not between fighter and ranger.
DR Metropolis tipped $3. Fighter has this grab bag problem too in later editions. It's not longer a lord or knight. It's just a weaponry staff class now.
I mean, you're not wrong. I mean, you're absolutely not wrong. And I do agree that the fighter now has this problem as well, where you're just grabbing random feats and random abilities out of a grab bag of different, you know, problems. And you're not, you know, the fighter was, like, as you pointed, you know, you were in some ways, you know, you were a leader of men, you were a leader of the people. And now, and, you know, a commander, a warrior, a fighter, you know, and now you're just a guy with random, you know, a gal with random weapon abilities. Now, Iuarta, I completely agree. I know I'm controversial for saying that. I think the Ranger, if anything, should be like a subclass of the fighter, or it should be an archetype in Pathfinder 2nd Edition terms. It should just give you, you know, a couple of additional wilderness-oriented abilities if you want to make it a class and have these class features. I just don't think the class identity is strong enough there. It used to have a very strong class identity back when it was fundamentally tied to Lord of the Rings. But as we've moved away from that and just thrown in all of these random influences that are now, and no one wants to get rid of them. Nobody wants to tell people that what a ranger isn't anymore. So now it's everything that has ever existed in the class's life cycle. So now it's got 2-weapon fighting, but also bows, but also pets, but also spells, but also not spells. It's just like everything. And so when a class is like, when you describe a class, like, what is this class actually good at? And you go, nothing, then it's kind of tough. And yeah, and again, but people feel very strongly about the paladin. People feel like, oh, the paladin's great. They've got these smite abilities. They've got these divine spells, and it feels very appropriate, and it feels different to a lot of people than a cleric, and it feels very different to people than a fighter. And you never hear people saying, where's my martial paladin? But you hear it all the time with the ranger. Martial ranger is a WoW hunter. You can't change my mind. I mean, again, I don't have enough experience with World of Warcraft to be able to tell you one way or the other, but, it depends on whether you want to say is having a pet and a pet ability a magical thing or not. I kind of think it is personally, but. Now, Derek brings up a good, interesting point. A fighter's job is to fight. A ranger's job is to guide. There are fictional niches there. They just never let the ranger guide because they don't develop exploration mechanics. Well, they did, Derek, and they just basically said, did you pick forest? Are you in a forest? Then it doesn't matter. You auto-explore it and nothing bad will happen to you. So they gave them that exploration niche by basically allowing you to skip over it and saying, see, aren't you glad you brought a ranger? They don't do anything for that. Yeah. But I also think that that's sort of this is something that 4th edition D&D tried to do. 4th edition D&D tried to let you have your cake and eat it too. And, one of the things that I've always sort of struggled with is this idea that back in the day in 1st edition AD&D, believe it or not, there was a class that was really good at fighting, and it was called fighter. The other classes weren't really supposed to be good at combat. I mean, their attack bonus was much lower. The cleric was notable in being halfway decent. They had good armor, but they had crap weapons. The wizard didn't have enough spells to be blowing off. Cantrips didn't even exist yet. And thieves were not rogues. All right. Backstab was not sneak attack, and thieves had D4 hit points. They were basically not supposed to fight. They were maybe supposed to jump in at one point in the fight. If someone ignored them and they were hiding in shadows, they could jump out and stab somebody in the back and then like run away. They were not a fighter. The combats were basically, if you wanted to fight and you wanted to do stuff, you were a fighter. If you wanted to deal with traps and climb walls and listen at doors and figure out stuff, then you chose to be a thief. So the classes had these niches that existed in very different parts of the game. At some point, the decision was made, probably in 3rd edition, but into 4th edition, certainly, which was, we don't want people sitting around doing nothing. We want everybody to be involved in every part of the game. And then they kind of said that, well, that's going to be really tough. How about this? How about we make everybody useful in combat? And we'll let the rogue be good in combat. We'll help their armor class out. We'll give them more hit points. We'll give them better attack bonus. We'll make sneak attack easier to pull off than a backstab. And you're like, yeah, but what about all that other stuff? Well, rogues will get to keep that too. They'll still be 8 or 10 skill points per level, and they'll just be really good at fighting too. And everybody can do something in combat. After all, that's what everybody loves, right? They all love Diablo. They all love EverQuest. They all love World of Warcraft. Let's just give them combat, and then have some of these classes be okay at these other pillars. And that style of design has just pervaded the game and infected it on such a level that you have this class-based design, which used to be about all-encompassing around the game, and now it's mostly focused just on combat. And I think that is to the game's detraction. And I've often thought it would be interesting to have, a class, like a combat class, but then almost have a separate thing that you do that is different outside of combat. So it's almost like you have 2 classes, right? Like your combat class and then your non-combat class. Call it something else. Call it your your class and your calling, or your class and your role, or something like that. So because I understand that from a play pattern perspective. Going into a fight and then telling everybody, hey, your class isn't a fighter, so you don't really get to participate in this encounter. Hey, we're exploring the dungeon right now, or whatever. We're in the wilderness. Your character can do nothing. You don't have any useful skills. You don't have anything useful to add. Just go sit down. That's kind of disheartening, right? Solemn Magus says, should have been an archetype, applies to a lot of the classes of Pathfinder 2. Completely agree with that. To be fair, if you tell me Aragorn is, you have to be, if you have to tell me a ranger is, you have to be Aragorn, I'm outlaw. It's interesting that you say that, though, because, I mean, if you're a paladin, you kind of have to be a paladin, right? If you're a sorcerer, you kind of have to be a sorcerer. I mean, again, I'm not saying that the ranger is a good class. In fact, just the opposite. I don't think it is a good class at all. I don't think it's interesting. I don't think it has a clear role. It's just, I think it's terrible. Oh, the Bard has suffered as well, and I think that unfortunately the Bard had an opportunity to be something interesting and unique, and they just never really did anything with it. Let's see here. Let's see here. I'm sorry, I'm just catching up on that thing here. Well, the other thing too that was interesting about the Ranger was that the original D&D game was obviously fundamentally about dungeons and exploring dungeons. So even though the Ranger in first edition AD&D was kind of positioned as a wilderness character class, it didn't really have like, here's a bunch of abilities that are only useful in the wilderness. Like your tracking was better in the wilderness than it was in the dungeon because of the percentage system. But by and large, the class was still designed to be a dungeon crawler. So, you're right. If you were to pick a feel for a modern ranger, the best approximation should be a monster hunter. It covers the skills, the stealth, and the combat. The problem I have with that is when I hear monster hunter, my brain goes to, so they're like a fighter. It's difficult for me to, imagine what, and this is the problem I have. The problem I have is the only thing for me that distinguishes a ranger from just a fighter with a random assault, like, it's a fighter that uses traps and a bow. Okay, so that's a fighter. It's a ranger. Sorry, it's a ranger that uses a bow and traps. That's a fighter with bows and traps. It's a ranger that has an animal pet and a bow. So it's a fighter with an animal companion and a bow. Like if it's not magical, then it's just a fighter. So the thing that makes the ranger distinct from the fighter is the magical ability. Right? That is something that the fighter clearly does not have. So while I like the idea of the martial ranger, not as a class though, I just like the idea of the concept. I think the concept of the martial ranger should be expressed through the mechanics of a fighter and maybe an archetype, and just have some of these abilities. For me, the idea of the ranger class has to be distinct from the fighter. You have to rely on some sort of magical abilities, spells, special, the paladin has spells and smites and detect evils, and no one would confuse a fighter and a paladin because they just have this laundry list of abilities. They have these spells that feel very appropriate and thematic. They're very much tied into this very strong idea of being a defender, So I like that. And that's one of the reasons Paladin's one of my favorite classes. Even Ranger, ironically, is not my favorite class. So, and then the other problem is if you give the Ranger these sort of skill-like abilities, but you're now playing in a modern system, which has feats and skill trainings that kind of anyone can take, that really loses its specialness really quick. If what makes you special is like, hey, there's a skill that anybody can take in the game and you get it for free, it is something. You're giving me something, but it doesn't feel great, right? So, I've talked before about how I think having a magic class, a skill class, and a fighting class as the basis of your classes, I don't even necessarily know that you need a mix of everything else is great, and I love what he did with Worlds Without Number and stuff, Now, don't get me wrong. People always fought in D&D. That's always been a thing. It is, I'm not saying that they were wrong to try to make everybody have a role to play in combat. I hate it when my players have to sit around and not do anything because their character essentially is out of the combat, But, class, career, I don't know what you want to call it, but, class and calling or something. Well, fighting was definitely, you wanted to avoid fighting because you didn't really get anything for it, and you got most of your experience points from treasure. So if a thief could sneak in past the monster and get the treasure and get out, then you got basically 90 plus 95% of the experience and the treasure without any of the danger, right?
Metropolis tipped $3.
Thank you.
I disagree that martials must be strictly mundane. Even 2nd edition lists Beowulf and Hercules and other superhuman being as famous fighter.
Yeah, but I mean, Hercules, right? His special abilities is that he's got a really sweet ancestry, right? He's got a very powerful ECL, right? His race is demigod. So what he's doing there is, I mean, sure. I mean, we're playing D&D here, so it's martial characters are capable of such incredible, borders on magical, right? There's sort of an anime-esque approach to it. It's not like Conan. It's not like sword and sorcery, right? Real low grit. I'm not saying it's full anime either, but we have these high-level fighters that are doing stuff that, especially in the modern sense, that are borderline magical, but it is the case. A Song of Ice and Fire has rangers as the Night's Watchmen that would patrol north of the wall. I like that aspect of it. So let's talk about that. Song of Ice and Fire, the rangers of the north. What class are they? They're all fighters, right? They're not rangers. They're fighters, some of whom have picked up, ranks and skill in, survival and wilderness things. They don't have anything that really distinguishes them from any of the other soldiers or fighters in the thing, other than they wear black cloaks, right? That's it. So, and I like the Rangers of the North, in that respect. Draw Steel. Didn't Draw Steel split the combat stuff between class and kit? The kit, I was going to say the kit is still like what armor you're wearing, what kind of weapons you have, but yeah, their skill system is completely separate from their combat system, which is, fine. I mean, yes, if we're talking 3rd edition, yes, most of them are NPC classes. You are correct. But anyways, I struggle now. Do I have a copy of this? Let me see. Oh, here we go. I don't think I have this in PDF. Okay. But we're going to cover this someday. This is Monty Cook Presents Iron Heroes. It's by Mike Merles. Okay, let me see if I have that. I don't think I do. Oh, I do have it. Hot damn. Okay. I do have it. Since we're here, let's look. Okay. Now, a couple of things about Iron Heroes. This is not about the Rangers, okay? But the Iron Heroes is a variant D20 game. This is not just a splat book. This is a variant player's handbook. So the idea is that you would replace, this was written during 3rd edition. So this is the idea that you would replace your Pathfinder 1 book or your D&D 3.5 or 3rd edition 3.0 with this book. So this was a variant player's handbook. Okay. So your classes were Archer, Armiger, Berserker, Executioner, Harrier, Hunter, Man-at-Arms, Thief, and Weapon Master. They were all martial classes. There was one specialty spellcasting class, which was the Arcanist. All right? So this game took the approach of dividing up these classes into these different ideas. Now, some of them stand out, right? So you might not necessarily know what Armiger is, but Armiger is like a heavily armored character. The Archer obviously uses a bow. The Berserker is your barbarian type class. The Executioner is kind of like your rogue, right? They're more of like a WoW rogue, right? Where they like build up combo points and unleash devastating criticals or finishers. The Man-at-Arms is sort of more of your, jack of all trades, has a bunch of different weapons. The Weapon Master is sort of that one specialty Iaijutsu master. The Harrier is the quickly, the lightly armored, moving around the battlefield. Now, one of the things that, now you might say, well, Derek, aren't those all just fighters? And you would be right, except that this game uses this. Do we have a? Here we go. Except this game uses this idea of a token pool. Okay. And what this is during an encounter, many of the classes allow you to build up tokens, which you can then cash in to do special maneuvers for your character. So, for example, being an archer isn't just about having access to a bow. Everybody, a lot of classes have access to a bow. What being an archer gives you is it gives you access to the aim pool. Okay, and this is only given to you by being the archer class. And the way that the aim pool works is you can build up your aim pool by, keeping your bead on one target, and you keep building up aim points as you spend actions continuing to build up aim points and aim points. And then you can spend those aim points to do things like, a hamstring shot or a storm of arrows or an unerring shot or an armor piercing shot. So you have to take these different abilities and then you build up this aim pool. So sure, anybody could use a bow, but when an archer's using a bow, they have access to this aim pool, and it feels very, different. It feels very distinct. So the class that I always thought was really cool in this was the hunter. Okay. And this is a role that I don't think most people associate with the ranger or the hunter. And I think it's really cool. And it's actually my favorite version of this. So that's why I bring it up. People ask what's my favorite. Okay, here we go. Hunters are tough, independent warriors who use their strong grasp of tactics and clever stratagems to defeat their enemies. Many hunters wander the wilderness alone. When outnumbered or facing a single powerful beast, they make the most of terrain and their talents to survive. While hunters often work alone, they also make excellent leaders. A hunter may lack the social graces and winning smile of a thief, but he has the knowledge and battle lore to help others work together as a team. A hunter's timely advice can mean the difference between victory and defeat. The hunter gains access to a pool called the tactical pool. Okay? They can use the terrain to their advantage and can help the party fight together as a team. The hunter is a leader class. It's a strategist class. It's kind of a warlord class, Dr. Metropolis, in a way. And to me, that's really cool because that is a unique niche that isn't filled by these other classes. And to me, and I'm not going to get into all the different, abilities and all the different, things, but they get access to lore feats, tactics feats, and weapon feats. And they aren't so much primarily about going pew, 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 pew with a bow and randomly having two weapons, right? They're more about ambushes and positioning. It's like the Outwit Hardrick, which again, I mentioned from Pathfinder 2. I like the idea of the Outwit Ranger a lot. It's just unfortunate that in Pathfinder 2, that they made it's not that great. It's a really weird Ranger thing to me. Why not just make a Warlord class? Well, number one, level 2 janitor, it's not a Ranger, it's a Hunter. Number two, the Ranger didn't exist, or the Warlord didn't exist till 2008, and this came out in 2004 or something like that. I do like Rangers as movement-y skirmishers, though. Well, and so that's where the Harrier comes in. So this is the Harrier class. Harriers are scouts, rangers, and bushwhackers who rely on speed and agility to overcome their enemies. A Harrier is at her best when she is on the move. Unlike other warriors who might stand in place to use full attack actions, the Harrier fights best when she dodges between opponents, slips into their ranks, and delivers attacks from multiple angles as she speeds by. All right. And her pool is the mobility pool or mobile assault pool or something like that. And she gets all these different bonuses, and she actually deals more damage as she moves. So she's kind of, jumping in and out and all that other stuff. So the Harrier is that skirmishy ranger. In fact, they even use the term ranger to describe it. Whereas, again, the Hunter is more of I always think of the Hunter, I think of the Velociraptor, right, from Jurassic Park, where he's she'll look at you, and that's when the other two raptors strike you from the side that you didn't even know were there, and he's hunting the one, and then the other one busts in, and he goes, clever girl, and then busts him. So it's this idea of like hunting in packs and using the terrain to your advantage and being like aware of the positioning of everything. So, I don't know why even people who hate 4th edition love the Warlord, and I will never know why they don't have it in 5th edition. I will also say this to go back to 4th edition. When it comes to dungeon design, I don't like symmetry, but I do like a certain degree of symmetry in class design to a certain extent. And one of the things about 4th edition was, let me go to a whiteboard here, I guess. So one of the things about 4th edition was this idea that, and again, this has been well documented again, but you have this idea of the roles, right? We have the defender, the striker, that's the damage dealer, that's the DPS, right? The leader, that's the healer, the support class, and then the controller. And this is your sort of AoE damage or debuffer, right? Who take down the enemies in that regard. And then you had the power source. Okay, where'd you get your power from? So arcane, right, is sort of, your classic sorcery magic type thing. So for arcane defender, you had the sword mage, right, which was a Gish type character who used teleportation and energy shields. And then for striker, you had things like the warlock and the sorcerer. So these were all casting spells, but they did a lot of damage. And then for the leader, you had like the bard. The bard was actually an arcane leader. And then controller obviously is the classic wizard. So you could make an all arcane party and have a defender and a striker or two and a leader. Actually, there were other arcane leaders like the not the arcanist, what's it called? The artificer. The artificer was a leader. And you could have a wizard as your controller. So you have all of your bases covered, and everyone is from the wizard. You could all be from Hogwarts, which is so cool from like a thematic purpose. So one thing that people noticed, and just for completeness sake, I'll put in divine. Okay, so divine means, religion, touched by the gods, powerful, holy. So you had the paladin was your divine defender, right? The tank. And then you had the avenger, who was like your holy assassin, your holy warrior sent by, gods to punish the unworthy. You had the cleric for your leader. And then for the controller, you had the invoker, bringing down the god's wrath in waves of divine power, all this other stuff. And then we had martial. And these were the first 3 power sources that came out in the first player's handbook: arcane, divine, and martial. Some of these other classes didn't exist initially. They got added later. But you had the fighter as the defender, right? The tough, the tough gal who takes the hits and keeps on going. And then you had the warlord as the leader, this person who buffed and healed through morale and support and all this other stuff. And then as a striker, you had the rogue and the ranger. But there was no martial controller. And what I always thought they should have done is make the ranger the martial controller, right? They could use traps to debuff and slow their enemies. They could use gambits or tricks on the enemies to slow them down and mess them up. They could use barrages of arrows to sort of represent AoE damage. Now, they eventually create a class that's called the Seeker later on in 4th edition, but it's actually tied to the primal thing, and I don't like that as much. And then, yeah, the hunter was the right idea, Hardrick. The hunter was definitely the right idea. I just wish they had made the ranger the controller from the beginning, because I think that would have made the ranger at least feel much more distinct and given it a cooler place in 4th edition than literally just being, here's an endless stack of powers that just go pew, 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 which made it really, really boring. And I think between, me just talking about what I hoped the ranger could be, or what the hunter is from 4th edition. I think that's from the Essentials book, if you correct me if I'm wrong there, buddy. But, or from that hunter class, which I read you from Iron Heroes. The point is the ranger needs something to stand out and be different. And if it's going to be martial, if it's not going to have spellcasting capabilities, you got to do something really drastic. Otherwise, it is just a fighter with skills. And if it's just a fighter with skills, it's just going to fall short. It really is. So I know that a lot of people don't like the ranger with the spell-like abilities, which is fine, but I do think at least gives it something. And I think one of the questions that we should be asking ourselves is, why do we like the paladin with its spellcasting abilities and its magical abilities, and we don't like the sort of druidic ranger? So we like, right? Because right, on a fundamental level, you could say a paladin's just a cleric and a fighter. But it is not, right? There's more to it than just being a cleric or a fighter. It clearly stands out, and no one ever says, why can't I be a martial paladin? But the ranger, for some odd reason, fails that test. When you say it's just a druid and a fighter, people go, nah. And then you say, and people go, but I just want to be a martial ranger. So what is that? What is a martial ranger? What makes a martial ranger not just a fighter? That's the question I think these game designers have been trying to solve for a long time. And they couldn't figure it out. They failed in 4th edition because people revolted against 4th edition. And then so for 5th edition, they just went back and said, fuck it, here's everything. I don't know, pick what you like, Now, my surmising of this is, level 2 janitor here says, it's because when I picture a ranger, I don't picture them casting spells. I picture them tracking and foraging. Exactly. You kind of imagine Aragorn, right? Right? Like that's what you imagine, this wilderness guy who's, tracking the Uruk-hai across the plain and all this other stuff. But so in a way, that's what the ranger originally was, but they got rid of that. Thanks, Duncan.
DT tipped $3. The modern ranger is basically a homeless guy who sometimes has a dog.
Yeah, that's pretty much true. That's true. I mean, they don't necessarily have to be homeless. They can have a nice house. Lightly armored skirmish fighter is kind of a missing niche in D&D, so I could see why they went that direction in 40. Yeah, I mean, I guess, but isn't a lightly armored skirmish fighter a rogue? Isn't that a rogue? I think that's just a rogue. Satanic Panic, with a very appropriate name, says, when I picture a holy warrior, I don't picture them casting spells either. Whereas I totally do. I'm big. I like hybrid classes. I can't, I can't say, anything like this. You can be a ranger in real life. You can't be a paladin in real life. Oh, that's fair enough. Okay. But think about what a ranger is in real life. Is a ranger in real life some sort of like deadly 2-weapon fighter bow warrior? No, they're just a person who knows their park really well. They're a park ranger. That's all they are. I mean, that's a fine example, but I mean, a park ranger is just somebody who, knows the woods. Is that enough for a class? I don't know. I argue that it's probably not. It's also really interesting to me. I see a bunch of posts here. Marcos says, what I dislike more is that every class today is a caster class, so there's no flavor. The thing is, you're playing D&D, right? Like, you're fighting, weird floating eyeballs and, iron bulls that breathe petrification gas, and you're bedeckled in floating ion stones. And it's so weird for me where people are like, D&D has too many caster classes. It's like, it's D&D. Every aspect of that game, except for maybe like, I don't know, level 1 and 2 is dripping with magic. That monsters are magical. That's not magical. It's an animated undead. Like, how is that not magical? It's very magical. Oh, that's not magical. What are you talking about? It's a weird creature from another plane or from the dark side of things. Like, everything's magical. The magical items are magical. The monsters are magical. Everything's magical. So yeah, it makes sense that, everything would be magical. Magic in D&D is like technology in our world. Like, you're like, well, I'm not a programmer. Like, well, what do you do? I do construction. Oh, so you don't use technology? Well, I mean, I use laser levels and I use CAD software and I use, you use technology probably more than most people, even though you're not a programmer. Okay, fine. You're not a programmer, but you still use a shitload of technology. You may not be a wizard, a programmer, but you're using magic, right? You're using technology. So magic is like that in that respect. Solemn wants an atheist champion from Paizo. That wouldn't even make sense. Where would you get your power from? At that point, at the point you have an atheist champion, I'm like, what are we even doing here? You prefer when games take opportunities to make more martial classes instead of making everything magic, and ranger is one. And that might be valid in a non-D&D type world where, magic isn't so ubiquitous. I'm not even saying it's a good thing. I'm just saying it's the way it is. D&D and magic is pretty well integrated with one another. Well, the Knights on Crusades weren't paladins. The Knights on Crusades were fighters. What do you think of the UA spellless ranger? Not gonna lie, I do not know much about 5th edition, so I do not know as much about the non-basic stuff. So I do not know the UA spellless ranger. That's fair, level 2 janitor. If you are in a game that really cares about traversing the wilderness, it's enough for a class. But here's the problem. The problem is we're not playing that game, and neither is everybody else. We're playing combat the dungeoning. And so that means that the ranger has to have a niche in combat. So what is that niche? I guess sometimes dual wielding, sometimes shooting a bow. That is the real, God's honest truth. Is that if we did care enough about the wilderness and the wilderness did matter enough, then it would be a class. But it's not. And it's not the way that these adventures are written, and it's not the way that most people play. So to that end, the thing that matters is combat, and so the class has to have these combat potentials. Otherwise, it's not even worth its weight. And so that's why the wilderness abilities that you do get from most of these classes are very hand-wavy and don't really mean that much or do that much. He might be like a fighter ranger, I think. I don't know. I'd have to pull up my Dragonlance books. So I completely agree with level 2 janitor here as well. But again, it's a question of, is that enough of a class niche so I mean, let me put it another way. Should there be a class that has limited capabilities, but only has what we'll call social combat abilities, right? A class that only exists to function in the social pillar. And I know a lot of people go, that's the bard. No. The bard's got all these different spells, and they can definitely contribute in combat. They can give their skill dice and stuff like that. Like what makes the bard so good at a social combat? They have proficiency in diplomacy and a good charisma? No, I mean all their class features, a good chunk of their abilities are tied to what we would now call social conflict, right, or social combat. I don't think we see that. The dandy, which is not a class. It's an archetype. It's not a class. It's an archetype. That's all I'm saying. And that, I think, level 2 janitor is actually a good place to draw a line in the sand. I just don't think it's where most of these trad big market games like D&D and Pathfinder are ever going to land, because it's not worth it. They know that so much of their games revolve around combat, and they have just been beaten over the head with it. You know, it's not fun when somebody's really good at combat and you're not. And so they've tried really hard to make everybody good at combat. So, I like Kelsey's take on the Ranger. I assume you mean Kelsey Dion. Wilderness lore, herbal healing, and specific foe advantage. I guess maybe, I mean, some of the problem I guess I have with that is when things like that exist, you know, it always, for me as a class feature, it always begs me the question of like, well, why can't my non-ranger do that? Like, why couldn't I learn, can I learn herbal healing? You're like, well, no, you're a barbarian. You're like, why? I can't learn herbal healing. I mean, one of the things, I mean, it's a slippery slope that ultimately sort of kind of destroys class-based design. But it's kind of like when a class gives you an ability that feels like you could just like learn it, it's kind of like, why is that restricted or unique to that class? What is the historical or literature touchstone for paladins then? I don't know the story. Well, the literal paladins, I think are based off of the Knights of Charlemagne, who, you know, and the Knights of the Round Table, right? Who were like blessed by the Lady of the Lake and had like, you know, holy visions from God as they tried to quest to find the, you know, the Holy Grail or Roland and the right old Roland and the Paladins or something. I think is I'm trying to remember the name of the Roland is the one. It's literally, you know, divine holy questing knights with, you know, touched by God sort of idea here. Well, that's a good thing. And I mean, you know, there's obviously games that really do care about that, but by and large, I think that the modern audience has cares less about the hex crawling and cares less about the tracking of times. I mean, you're talking to a guy who's going to be running 2 Torchbearer campaigns, so obviously I really care about that stuff. But does every class need a non-basic attack? Well, I mean, that was the premise behind 4th edition, and I would even argue, you know, Pathfinder 2nd edition and 5th edition D&D, right? Like even a wizard always has a cantrip that they can cast, and it's not like embarrassingly bad. So everybody has a role to fill in combat. Pepper says D&D should add non-combat classes and then encourage multi-classing and then make it easier to level and then add maybe more levels, like say 50, and everybody could start off at level 5. Wow, Pepper, if they made a game like that, can you imagine how cool that would be? They did make a game like that. It's called Fabula Ultima. Yeah, Wayfarer is a great example of a class from good old Fab Alt. And this is not a Fabula Ultima challenge, but so in Fabula Ultima, you go up to level 50, and there's a bunch of different classes. There's, you know, this is just from the core book. There's the Wayfarer, there's the Tinkerer, but you can only get to level 10 in one class. So, you know, you're going to have, at a minimum, you're going to have 5 classes by the end of the game, assuming you go to 50. So, and you can't have more than 3, and then the class is called Mastered. And by the way, there are more options to take in that class than exist through the 10 levels. In other words, you won't be able to get everything that comes through being that class. So the Wayfarer, also the Adventurer, also the Explorer, also the Treasure Hunter. Vin with a super chat. I am on break. Just wanted to say I was right about the poll. I guess that means that the overwhelming majority said they want some dice. So Wayfarers, nomads searching for a fabled continent, explorers braving the wilds, grizzled hunters, and travelers all have one thing in common. They are wayfarers. While a majority of heroes travel the world during their adventures, wayfarers live for the journey. They are always eager to visit new places and learn from others. In the eyes of a wayfarer, the wilderness is neither foe nor an ally, but a stern teacher who can reveal forgotten truths. So we have some questions here. What led you to live a life of endless travels? Was it your choice? Are you tired? Is there a place or person that feels like home to you? You have met many people and visited many places. Is there one you can't forget? You lost something or someone because of your travels. What happened? So as a wayfarer, you are going to gain up to 10 levels of wayfarer. So you can get these abilities. Now, some of these abilities, like Faithful Companion and Resourceful and Tavern Talk, you can take multiple times. So Tavern Talk, you can take up to 3 times. So what can you get? Well, the first is you can get a Faithful Companion. Together with the rest of your group, design a level 5 beast, construct, elemental, or plant creature. It becomes your companion. So if you want the pet class, you pick up some things in Wayfarer. Now, this thing has some attacks, but it doesn't get a turn during conflicts. But on your turn, you can use your action to have your companion perform an action. And if you leave a scene, your companion leaves with you. Additionally, you can recover inventory points. This game uses a sort of quantum inventory. And instead of like saying, I have 5 potions and 3 tonics and 2 elixirs, you just have a resource called IP, inventory points. So this basically says every time you guys travel overland, you get back some inventory points so that your character always has stuff in their pack. Tavern Talk. Whenever you rest, which is like taking a long rest, in an inn or a tavern, you may ask the game master up to skill level, which you could put up to 3 ranks in this, questions about your surroundings and the people who live here. The game master will answer truthfully and describe how you gathered this information. And then Treasure Hunter. When your group journeys on the world map, you will make a discovery on a roll of skill level +1 or lower on the travel roll instead of only on a 1. So when you're traveling, some areas you roll a d6, some areas you roll a d8, some areas you roll a d10. And normally, if you roll a 1, you make a interesting discovery, some opportunity or cool thing. Well, a treasure hunter, if you take ranks in this, you get a better chance of that happening. And lastly, well-traveled. You reduce the die rolled by your travel rolls by 1 size to a minimum of d6. So again, you could be in an area which is very dangerous and is a d8 or a d10 travel roll. Your character would reduce that from a d8 down to a d6. And then you could have Treasure Hunter and find stuff on a roll of 1, 2, or 3. So there are literally like no combat abilities in this class. It's just traveling. It's just traveling and exploring and, being a treasure finder, a treasure hunter, and an explorer and adventurer. But remember, too, your character isn't just a wayfarer. They can't be. By definition, you have to start the game with at least 2 or 3 classes because you start at level 5 and you can't put them all into one class. And even if, you can see, you could take Faithful Companion 5 times, Resourceful 4 times, that's 9 points. Tavern Talk 3 times, that's 12. 13, 14 for Treasure Hunter, 15 for Well-Traveled. Well, you only get 10 points before you master this class. And once you master the class, you can't take any more levels in it. So anyways, so there's no combat abilities. It's, you get a cool, fun pet. You can recover inventory points. You can ask questions about the people and surroundings when you're at an inn. And, you modify the game mechanics so that you find more opportunities when you're traveling on the Overland world map. And that's the Wayfarer. So that's what one of those classes looks like. So, I love this. Favorite Ranger instantly. Everything I ever wanted. This is the sort of thing Rangers should be about. So going back, imagine you start the game off and you start at level 5 and you take 2 levels or 3 levels of Wayfarer. And then you take 2 or 3 levels of Sharpshooter. Boom. There you go. There's a Ranger, that you want. It's not magical, and it has cool archer, barrage abilities, crossfire, Hawkeye, warning shot abilities, and you also have some cool traveling abilities. And boom, and then you're done. Yeah, you actually could have up to 3 classes at the beginning of the game. So maybe we have 2 levels of Wayfarer, we have 2 levels of Sharpshooter, and then we have 1 level of Lore Master, also Sage Scholar. So we could pick 1 level and pick, Quick Assessment, or a trained, at the start of a conflict, we may spend some of our mind points. Choose a creature you can see, and the GM reveals one of their traits, or names a damage type and choose a creature you can see, and the GM will reveal their affinity towards that damage. So there you go. So you're a character who, does this and does that and has all these things. Pathfinder PhD. I have a Wayfarer and Sharpshooter for my character in my FU campaign. There you go. Sweet. Dr. Metropolis says, no combat abilities. It's so beautiful. I'm not crying. And that's because the classes in this game don't have to be that, you can get your combat abilities from a different class. It might surprise you to learn that the class called the Weapon Master has a lot of combat abilities. And so if you want combat abilities, you just go pick them up from Weapon Master, you go pick them up from Sharpshooter, or you go pick them up from the Fury. But if you want other types of abilities, you can go work on that. Or you can go pick those up instead. Nothing else has sold me on Fabula Ultima as much as this. There's no substitute for really good class design. I don't think people talk about that enough when describing systems. I mean, I agree. So the long and the short of it is, I don't really think any of the Rangers are good. That's why I never really played them. In some theoretical world, I love the idea of the 1st edition Ranger because I love Lord of the Rings and I love Aragorn and I love the idea of this, defender of civilization against the evils of the wild, the uncaring wilderness. But, you really have to roll high on your stats and, then you have to play 1st edition D&D. By the time we got to 2nd edition, it was muddied and weird and had this dual wielding thing. The 3rd edition Ranger I thought was, just splashable and forgettable. The 4th edition Ranger was extremely powerful, but it was martial only, and it just shot bows really fast, or it just swung its swords really fast. It just did a ton of damage. It did nothing else. It was just pew, 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 pew. There was no flavor. There was no soul. Gone were any of these cool intrinsic elements, and it wasn't even a wilderness warrior. It was just like an archer who shot fast. It literally did not feel like a ranger in any sense of the imagination. And then for 5th edition, they went back to this kind of random wilderness druidic grab bag. And not a huge fan of that either, as one can imagine. I will point out, going back to Fabula Ultima, you could also be, say, a Sharpshooter. You could also say be a Sharpshooter, get your Ranger shot abilities on. But then you could also pick up Chimerist, also Druid, Shapeshifter, or Wild Mage. And you could pick up abilities like Feral Speech. You can communicate with creatures of the beast, monster, and plant species. It's 1 point out of 50 that you get for the whole game. And now you can communicate with all of those things. In addition, you could potentially start mimicking the powers of different beasts, monsters, or plants and gain some of their abilities as basically spells. Blue mages, for those of you who know Final Fantasy. If you want to have a, kind of a more of a nature magic type thing. So you can just build whatever you want. So, and these are just the core classes of the game. Anyways. I went Wayfarer, Tinkerer, Rogue. I'm a traveling alchemist. Yeah, so what Pepper isn't saying there is normally in the game, you start with, correct me if I'm wrong, Pepper, you start with 6 inventory points. But Wayfarer increases that by 2. Tinkerer increases that by 2. And Rogue increases that by 2. So instead of starting with 6 inventory points, Pepper's character starts with 12 inventory points. So basically their character just has a huge quantum resource to basically pull out different items that the party needs at any time. So, is PF2 Ease 1 also just pew pew? I think so. I mean, the feats that the ranger gets are almost, in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, are almost entirely combatively focused. There are very few spells or abilities that aren't combatively focused. And the handful of ones that are pretty niche and don't really, do a lot. I mean, if we just look at the beginning classes, you got crossbow ace. These are just like the level 1 ones. Crossbow ace, animal companion, which gives you an animal to fight with. Crossbow ace does more damage with a crossbow. Hunted shot lets you take 2 shots. Initiate warden gives you warden spells, which are combat in nature. Monster hunter gives you a damage bonus versus monster. Twin takedown, which lets you swing your sword, your 2-handed weapons twice. Favored terrain. You have to pick one terrain, and while you're there, your tactical speed changes. Like if you choose aquatic, you get plus 10 feet to your swim speed. If you choose forest, mountain, or underground, you get plus 10 feet to your climb speed. Hunter's aim, another combat ability. Monster warden, a combat ability. Quick draw, a combat ability. United assault, snare hopping. These are all combat abilities. Companion's cry, disrupt prey, far shot, Farabella's flip, favored prey, giant hunter. These are all combat abilities, and that's just all of the feats. I mean, I'm not skipping any. I mean, that's just all of them. But I don't even know. I'm up to level 4, and I really haven't seen a feat yet that is not combative in nature. And then the class itself gets you get your initial you get hunt prey, which is obviously used for hunting prey. It's combative in nature. And then you get your ranger feats, and you get level 5. When you move through natural terrains, you are hard to track. You gain the benefits of covering your tracks in such terrains, even if you don't move at half speed. So you get that ability. And you're like, oh, Nature's Edge. Nope, it's a combat ability. You always find the weak points in your foe's defenses when they are on unfavorable terrain. Enemies are off guard to you if they're in difficult terrain. There we go. At level 11, you can treat natural obstacles and ignore the effects of difficult terrain. And that's it. Those are the only 2 abilities that you get as a ranger that are not combat in nature. So it's pretty combative in nature. Dr. Metropolis says, we've learned D&D class design is trash. Good ranger stream, very fitting, to be honest. Well, it is what it is. Pepper, we did not choose to use quirks for our game. Duncan says, if FabU had a way to do grid-based combat, it would be a perfect game. I've heard people say that, and I certainly can appreciate that, like if it's more of a Final Fantasy Tactics style. But I also think that what the game needs is something that is not grid-based, because they just take too long. And I know that there's one optional system for the idea of a front rank and a back rank. But if we could take something from the One Ring 2nd Edition, which has this idea of positions, and do a very abstract sense, I think we could get a little bit of that tactical component without being a full grid-based thing. And I think that would be a kind of an ideal sweet spot, because going to a grid-based combat, I think would just eat up too much time. Even Final Fantasy games traditionally are not grid-based combat, right? It's do 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 do. They're just lined up on either side, right? You have your back rank, front rank. That's it. Dill, I agree with you, but I think that's true of almost all of these modern games, which is they feel like a skirmish game. In fact, I used to play the Dungeons and Dragons miniature skirmish game, and spoiler alert, it was just the rules to D&D. They just got rid of all the pretend stuff about this game isn't just about fighting. It was a great game. Tim and I used to go to Gen Con and play in tournaments. It was awesome. Wojo, a bit behind. Didn't we like the Grim Wild Ranger? I didn't like it as much as the Wizard. I remember that. I'm trying to remember it specifically. I thought it was okay. I liked it. I think I gave it high ranks, just not the highest of ranks. Yeah, these read like Pathfinder 2 abilities. Did we add half our level? Yeah, right. Benjamin, PF2 Ranger is about shooting 4 arrows in a turn, hitting once for 2d6, and then watches the fighter crits for 50. Accurate. Oh, hits for 50, and then slows the target, knocks them prone, and sets them on fire. Yes, I think using the what does he call it? The ultimate dungeon terrain, the UDT. I think something like that could work. I don't know if I have the One Ring PDF, but no, I don't have it around. I don't think I have it yet, but we might do the One Ring on Thursday. I call it a first look because I haven't really played it, but I've read through the One Ring, so it's not like a real first look, but it has this interesting semi-tactical positioning here. Dodge Metropolis, I think a lot of people that are playing D&D in these games should be playing tactical skirmish miniature games. Frostgrave is a great one. So, Chainmail, yes. Actually, I think there's a lot of people that would really love the original D&D skirmish mini game. Karama, I don't know how we could set this up, but we should talk. Like, we should figure out if there's a way to bring that to the game system and then somehow convert people's characters into the D&D minis skirmish mechanics, because then it'll be really quick. But like that game literally has like, victory point conditions and victory zones, and it's like a whole thing. And I know a lot of people do that with PBX or Northern Reaches anyways. So it's something I've actually thought about wanting to set up before, is actually maybe even do like a league. I just don't know how well it would be integrated with Foundry, but maybe we could find we could find a developer. I could throw them $1,000 or something, or $1,500 or something, and I'm sure they could design us something. Oh, Joe, I've got a ton. And to be fair, I like the original one that was 3rd edition a little bit more. They kind of changed it over to sort of a 4th edition style when 4th edition D&D came out. And I don't think it was as good as 4th edition, but it was still pretty good. Anyways, so yeah, the long and the short of it is, fundamentally, I like the 1st edition Ranger, but I understand that is like really tied to the trope of Aragorn, and I just like the trope of Aragorn. After that, it became a mixed bag of I think, false promises and flawed attempts to sort of narratively capture this idea of a class that doesn't exist, and it suffered from the lack of a skill system, and so you couldn't have a wilderness fighter without having a different class, which was the Ranger. And then as that became not true, then the Ranger didn't really have a place in the game anymore. And they tried to make it into they got rid of its magic and made it into an obscene damage dealer in 4th edition. But that was so boring and flavorless that in 5th edition, they just brought back all the magic. In fact, they made it more magical. And then they also somehow gave it wilderness abilities that make the wilderness pointless, thus defeating the purpose of choosing to be a class because you want to interact with that part of the pillar of the game. It'd be like saying, I really love interaction, and I really love social interaction, so I'm going to choose this class. And the GM's like, great, everyone agrees with you, and you always get your way. And you're like, well, that's not exactly what I wanted. And I don't know. I haven't been super impressed by a Ranger ever. Bob played like 3 Rangers in our Pathfinder 2 campaigns over the years, and all of them were meh, sus at best. I mean, like, they were just really, really underwhelming most of the time. I mean, there would be a time where he'd like hit with his axe with his precision and crit, and it would be like a good damage, but like it was so rare and infrequent, it just didn't even matter. Yeah, I mean, exploration has a whole skew of problems. I mean, not the least of which is, for the most part, it seems to me like most people just aren't interested in that element of the game. And, that's unfortunate. And I mean, some of it has to do with the rewarding systems. If the rewarding systems aren't in place, why would you go explore? If the plot of the game is very, a lot of people, I see this advice all the time. Professor Dungeon Master just gave this advice the other day. He said, he was talking about wrapping up his campaign. And he said, you have to have a time limit. The clock has to be ticking. Why did my players enter this tower? Because he was going to blow up the moon or something like that, or he was going to shoot a rocket into the city or something like that. I don't remember what it was, but he's like, but the clock was ticking and they had to race against time. That's how you make your games exciting. That's how you add tension. That may be all very true, but that is the anathema to exploration, because if the clock is ticking, then you're not exploring. You're panically looking, and you're not taking your time, and you're not indulging your curiosity, and you're not like, oh, I wonder what's on the other side of those mountains. You know, we don't know. The map is blank. I'd love to find out what's there. What could we explore there? What could we find? And if the answer is we don't have time for this, the city's going to blow up, we have to race to the next breadcrumb in this adventure that we're racing, then it doesn't matter. In fact, if you put the party has to find their way through stuff, they're just going to be annoyed by it because they're going to be like, this is getting in the way of our mission, which is we have to stop the thing. I don't want to get bored by, get frustrated by having all these stupid hex exploration that we have to deal with. We need to solve this thing. We have to go through this dungeon. That sounds terrible. We need to just get to let me fight the monster so we can save the day. Additionally, when your game is super hyper balanced, what's on the other side of that mountain? Well, the same thing that's on this side of the mountain. Balanced monsters, balanced treasure, balanced XP. Every area becomes the same because the whole game is predicated upon boring shit. It's all the same. There's no reason to explore if what you would find next door is the same thing that you would find down the street. And if the thing down the street does have better treasure, it means that it has monsters which are 3 or 4 or 5 levels higher. And if you're playing a game like Pathfinder 2 or 4th edition D&D, it means you can't fight them and there's nothing you can really do to them anyways. Bag of Holding is now part of the Bag of Holding does kill the exploration pillar. There's no doubt about that. As does the light cantrip, right? As does the create water spell cantrip. As does the create food and water. But part of the reason for that is because back in the day, the idea of D&D was that after a long enough period of time of playing these games, you would get bored of that and want something to do differently. And the idea is that you're playing original D&D, you've been worried about torches and water and equipment and encumbrance for maybe years. And you're finally like level 7 because back then you leveled really slow. And like as part of the reward for getting over that hump of the game, it was like, hey, you don't have to worry about that much anymore. You don't have to sweat that stuff anymore. And it felt like a reward. Now, we've talked about this on our streams, but most of you guys have probably not seen it. But I'm running a Torchbearer game, and in our Torchbearer game, all the characters' inventory is actually stored as tokens on the grid, and so everybody's character has all of their equipment and stuff located here. And so like the way that the equipment works is like if you have a backpack, then you get this many slots of your backpack. You get 6 slots for your backpack. And in this case, this character is carrying a water skin in their backpack. So they get to there's some wine like right here. They have a belt pouch on their belt. So they get an extra slot here for their belt stuff. So this game is all about inventory. It's all about managing torches and how much food and drink and water. This character here, Sadok Saddlebelly, the halfling, he's going into the adventure with a sling in one hand and a jug full of wine in the other hand. So, but if you took this game and you made it so that, the backpack had 20 slots, it would be a lot less compelling. It would take something away from the game. That being said, after you played this game for a long enough period of time, you might be really bored of that and want to do something different. So, right. And I agree, Benjamin, nowadays people associate power leveling or power fantasy with numbers go burr and I look how much damage I do and my hit points are so high and my AC is so high. But I absolutely agree with you. And part of the problem with D&D is nowadays all those inconveniences, you basically start the game and you're already ignoring them. Most encumbrance systems are so generous that it's like you might as well start with a bag of holding. In Pathfinder 2nd edition, a week of rations is, I think, light encumbrance, which is like 1/10 of encumbrance or something like that. It's crazy. The point is like you could carry essentially infinite food in your backpack for all intents and purposes. And water is available via a cantrip, which you can use infinitely. And light is available everyone has light as a cantrip and they can cast it infinitely. So we start already getting rid of all of those quote unquote inconveniences. So there's never that moment where you go, remember when this stuff mattered and now we're cool and we're higher level and we don't have to worry about it as much. And you get this gradual feeling of earning your way into that. We just disperse with that entirely now. So that is another reason I think people don't want to deal with this. Right. Yeah. I mean, remember walking around, you get your mount and you feel like, oh my God, especially you get your flying mount at, I can't remember what level that was, 60 or something. And you're like, look at this. The whole game has changed now. I can fly where I want to go. And it just felt like such a, I used to have to take the trolley or I used to have to take the griffin, and now I can fly myself like that. What an amazing change. And we've taken some of that away from the game. So, okay. I mean, I thought it was Thursday. I was like excited. I was like, oh, tomorrow's Friday, end of the week. It's only been 2 days. It's been such a long week. All right. Well, that is going to conclude our history class. We've covered all 11 of the core classes, from Bard to Ranger, from Rogue to Wizard. And hopefully you've learned something along the way. You found some value in understanding where these games have come from. I don't expect this to help you pick your next feat at your next D&D level up, but there's a history to this game. There's a deep and abiding reason. Sometimes it's a bad reason, but there's a reason why things exist the way they do in the game. It's not always for a good reason. Sometimes it's just because of nostalgia and a sacred cow that we have yet to part with, and people would bitch endlessly. Vanilla and BC were amazing. I didn't play Wrath of the Lich King. I quit before that. I played Vanilla and BC. I thought it was amazing. I thought it was a great experience. I came back to play Cataclysm and Mists of Pandaria. I quit after that, and I haven't played again since. But Vanilla and BC was incredible. Hey, what's up, Booth B? Good to see you. Yeah, I think they're interesting, especially for people who may not have as deep of a knowledge of where this game has come from, and just to see how some of these game elements are still in the game after 50 years. And sometimes it's vestigial, like it's still in the game and there's no real reason for it, but it's still there just because it's always been there. My takeaway from this is that I need to play Fabula Ultima. Well, we are, like I said, I'm for my personal home game, we are kicking off a Fabula Ultima campaign. So that's what we've been kicking off, and that's what we're gonna to play. So that's what we're gonna be playing, at least in 2025. Did you purposely save the lamest class for the last history lesson? Well, it's definitely the most hot take class, Booth B, because my general assessment is I don't like the Ranger. I don't like the spellcasting Ranger because I feel like it feels like a mixed bag that doesn't know what it wants to do. And I don't like the Martial Ranger because it feels just like a fighter that has wilderness skills, which is just a fighter with wilderness skills. So I don't like the Ranger as it's designed pretty much in any class, in any version of the game. Pathfinder 1, 3rd edition, 4th edition, 5th edition, 2nd edition. And I like the 1st edition Ranger, but I understand that it's basically an Aragorn clone, and I'm okay with that. But outside of that, yeah, I don't really like it. I've never played a Ranger. I've never been interested in the class. And for whatever reason, people love it. I don't know the stats, but I've been told that like the Hunter class is one of the most popular classes in WoW, or it's certainly one of the most popular classes amongst newer people. I don't know why that is, but there's something that really appeals to people about the Ranger, and I don't know why it doesn't appeal to me. I used to think maybe it's like a pet class thing, but to me, the Druid was always the pet class thing. See, Hardrick said pet. And which is funny because I love pets. I love my dogs. I mean, they're great, but when I played WoW, it was all about the Warlock and the Succubus. Yeah, no, I like the Void Stalker. The Void Stalker was cool. What were they? There was Succubus, the Void Stalker, and the Infernal. Were those the 3 pets of the Warlock? Am I getting that right? People love bringing their pets into life-threatening situations. Oh my God, there's a greater demon. Go get him. Go get him, boo-boo. Is it like a Pokemon thing? Because like I was like a little too old for Pokemon. Like I never really played a Nintendo because I thought it was for kids. So maybe I just missed that Pokemon thing. I don't know. I just never got the pet class thing. Has just never been a thing for me. My first WoW character was a dwarf rogue named Aldrich. And I never raided. I never joined a guild. I did the dungeons, and then I did eventually, when they created heroic dungeons, I did heroic dungeons and pickup groups. But I did a lot of PvP. I used to do a lot of battlegrounds, like a lot, especially during the Burning Crusade era. I just did endless battlegrounds. In fact, I would say probably 50+% of my time spent playing WoW was spent playing in battlegrounds. So, Alterac Valley and Warsong Gulch and all those different places. What's the other one I'm thinking of? Not Alterac Valley. The A one. Arathi Highlands, which was one of my favorites. Anyways, so I played a rogue, and I did a lot of PvP with the rogue. And then I made a gnome warrior and played him for a while. And then my final character was a dwarf priest who was mostly disciplined, but I did love going to shadow in PvP sometimes and spiking on people. And that was pretty cool. But those were like the 3 classes I really played in WoW, I think. Rogue, dwarf rogue, gnome warrior, dwarf priest. I think that's it. And I'll just say, Alliance, Horde can suck it. Pet class is just safer, can always run away while the boar eats the dirt. I mean, that makes total sense. It feels like a degree of separation, right? A degree of protection because you're not in danger. Your pet's in danger. Maybe that's why it's so appealing to new people, I guess. I had a player play a ranger, have a pet, and use it to trigger traps in the first adventure. It did not survive. Oh, that's excellent. Main tank and MC undead fighter on a PvP server. I obviously am a masochist. Absolutely. Although undead the horde was so much better in PvP. Like undead were so good. My 4E 2-blade wood elf ranger will always be in my heart. Oh, that's an awesome character. Wood elf character, by the way, wood elves, wild elves, they had their ability was they had an encounter power as a race that they could re-roll one of their attack rolls once per fight. So on a DPS class, that was pretty powerful. First character ever, and I had tons of fun with it, even if it wasn't optimized. I'm glad you covered the history of the class. Look, the ranger was undoubtedly powerful, right? Matt the Cat, Matt Holloway, who played Burl on this show in our earlier Rise of the Ruins, he had a dragonborn ranger named Kamal, and he was a ranger. His paragon path was pit fighter, and then his epic destiny was demigod, and he was absurdly powerful and did an absurd amount of damage. So he was very powerful, but fairly one-dimensional. I mean, he just did a lot of damage, and that was the end of that. That was the end of that. Actually, our party was very martially oriented. Tim, also from Night's Last Call, Tim played a halfling rogue, and Aaron played a human warlord, and our buddy Rich played a dwarf fighter. So we had all 4 martial characters, and then the 5th character was played by our friend Ross, who played an Eladrin wizard, because that was the only controller in the original player's handbook, and we wanted a controller. So everybody was a martial except for that. So you had 2 martial strikers. We had the rogue, and then we had the ranger. And the amount of damage the ranger did compared to how much damage the rogue did was not even close. The ranger way out damaged the rogue, and I felt kind of bad for Tim for that purpose. Sorry, Tim. I don't know what we were supposed to do, but it's not like Tim didn't know his stuff. It's just it was not close. Anyways, Thursday, I'm thinking we might do the One Ring. So, kind of like I said, kind of a first look, and we'll get to that. And eventually, like I said, we're going to do another EU stream probably later this month. I'll figure out some time that'll work for that. We need to talk more about Pathfinder 2, more dungeon creation streams, and because we want to talk about all spells. We want to talk about some of those spells that got re-ranked in the Master, get some more of my patrons on who know their shit. The elitist according to the internet comments, the elitist know-it-alls, and we'll get them to give us some thoughts on their opinion. And in the meantime, Bob and I are working on our Dragonbane mega game, Dragon Tide. The GM Council is getting ready for our Northern Reaches Season 3 kickoff here hopefully in like 6 weeks, 8 weeks. I know that they've been doing a lot of votes and polls and surveys, and I'm actually kind of behind. I need to catch up on that. So we're going to have tons of PF2 energy, new PF2 mega game in our Season 3. We're going to have hopefully a Dragonbane mega game. I've got my Torchbearer games to run. fabulous Ultima home game. So 2025 is looking pretty good for right now. I just signed up my badge for Gen Con. I don't know if I'm going yet. It depends on my hotel room situation. Also, I'm kind of off Gen Con completely. Origins is just a lot easier and more. It's easier for me to get to. It's cheaper for me to go to, and there's more of my friends and patrons going, so it's just kind of a better experience all in all, and it's less infinitely crowded. But we'll see. All right, folks. Well, that's going to do it for me tonight. We'll be back Thursday, and again, comment, subscribe if you're not already done so. Let me know what you think about the Ranger. Do you like martial Rangers, spellcasting Rangers? Is there a particular reason or type that you like? If you're in fifth edition, tell me what you think of the 2024 Ranger. Did they really fix it? Because I know the 5th edition 2014 Ranger is considered universally bad, and you would have a much better take on it than me. So let me know in the comments below. I'll definitely read them and reply to you. But other than that, thanks everybody for hanging out with me. Thanks again for supporting this series throughout the last 2 years, and hopefully we'll have another cool one coming up next. Of course, as always, the patrons will help guide and support that, and we'll continue to dig into this awesome, incredible hobby of ours. I do love D&D. I may not be playing much of it these days, but ultimately, at the end of the day, D&D is where my heart is, and it always will be. So it's always fun to go back and relive some of those great memories and see where the game came from and where it's going. All right, everybody. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time on Knights of Last Call. Peace.